Here's what I'm seeing with this Thursday night NC State-Wake Forest matchup. And honestly, there's some fascinating stuff brewing beneath the surface that most people are probably missing. So NC State just pulled off this impressive comeback against Virginia, down 10 points. Then they completely flipped the script in the second half. 21-7 in the third quarter, shutout in the fourth. That's not just luck, that's systematic adjustments. And here's the thing that caught my eye. Their sophomore quarterback C.J. Bailey is starting to look legit. 16 of 22 for 200 yards, plus he's got wheels, 44 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. But here's where it gets interesting for betting purposes. Hollywood Smothers just broke out with 136 rushing yards and 2 scores. So now NC State has this dual threat thing working with both Bailey and Smothers, contributing in the run game. That's a problem for defenses to solve, especially on short notice. Now flip to Wake Forest, and this is where things get really compelling. Demans Claiborne was banged up with ribs in the opener, right? Limited touches. Team only scored 10 points total. Fast forward to last week. This dude goes for 193 yards on just 10 carries. 10 carries. 3 touchdowns, including an 83-yard house call where he wasn't even touched. Wake Forest went from scoring 10 points in their opener to 42 last week. That's not just Claiborne getting healthy. That's an entire offensive identity finding itself. And their defense? They've allowed 19 total points through 2 games. 19. That's their best back-to-back defensive performance since 2017. Here's the situational angle that's really intriguing though. Both teams are coming off short weeks. But Wake Forest just played this marathon weather-delayed game. Over 3 hours of delays, then they had to come back and execute. That shows mental toughness, but it also means less recovery time before Thursday night. The power rankings suggest NC State should be favored, and the market seems to agree, but Wake Forest got that explosive element with Claiborne that could break this thing open if he stays healthy. Plus, their home field advantage, though it's only worth about 2.3 points, which is below average, still helps offset some of that power ranking disadvantage. What I keep coming back to is this. NC State's shown they can make second-half adjustments and grind out wins. Wake Forest shown they can explode offensively when healthy. Both defenses are playing at a high level. In a short week, Thursday night environment, that feels like the kind of spot where the more explosive team might have the edge. The weather's going to be perfect. 69 degrees, minimal wind, no precipitation. So we're looking at pure football with no external factors. Which means this comes down to who can impose their will on a short week. So let me just say this up front. Indiana State versus Indiana is about as lopsided as it gets in college football. We're talking about a ranked team hosting an FCS opponent, and while the betting markets haven't even bothered setting a line, the power rankings tell us everything we need to know about this mismatch. But here's the thing. Indiana's actually in a fascinating spot right now. They dropped from number 20 to 23 after that closer-than-expected win over Old Dominion. And you could sense some questions starting to bubble up about whether this Hoosiers team is for real. Well, they answered those questions in a big way last week, absolutely demolishing Kennesaw State 56-9. Fernando Mendoza looked like a completely different quarterback than what we saw early in the season. 18 of 25 for 245 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's the kind of efficiency that wins games in the Big Ten. And here's what I really liked. The chemistry with Elijah Surratt was undeniable. 3 touchdown catches for Surratt, but Mendoza was spreading it around to multiple receivers. That's exactly what you want to see from a transfer quarterback finding his groove. The balanced attack is what jumps out to me, though. Lee Beebe Jr. ran for 90 yards. Omar Cooper Jr. broke off a 75-yard touchdown on an end around. I mean, when you're getting production from that many different places, you become really hard to game plan against. And look, Indiana State's defense, they're not exactly equipped to handle this kind of offensive versatility. Now, the execution piece is huge here. 0 turnovers, only 3 penalties, outgained their opponent 593 to 271. That's the kind of clean football that suggests good coaching and preparation. Curt Cignetti's got these guys dialed in, and it shows. Here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective, though. And this is where you really need to think critically about these FCS versus FBS matchups. The power rankings show an extreme mismatch. But here's the problem. Efficiency metrics become way less reliable in these spots. You're dealing with such a talent disparity that the numbers can get really skewed. Plus, Indiana's home field advantage is only 2.3 points, which is below average. So even though they're at home, they're not getting the typical boost you'd expect. But honestly, with this kind of talent gap, does it even matter? The weather's going to be perfect. 67 degrees at kickoff, minimal wind from the east-southeast at about 4 miles per hour. No precipitation expected. Basically, ideal conditions for Indiana to do whatever they want offensively. The depth factor is really compelling too. Alberto Mendoza, Fernando's brother, came in during the fourth quarter and went 3 for 3 for 35 yards and a touchdown. When your backup quarterback is executing that cleanly in garbage time, it tells you something about the program's development across the entire roster. Look, the real question here isn't whether Indiana wins. They're going to boat race Indiana State. The question is execution and style points. This is Indiana's chance to really make a statement before Big Ten play heats up. After that Old Dominion scare, they need to show they can handle business against lesser competition the way a ranked team should. And from a program-building perspective, these are the games where you establish your identity, where you work on your timing, get your depth players meaningful reps, and build confidence heading into conference play. Cignetti's got his team clicking right now, and everything suggests they'll use this as a tune-up rather than a trap game. So we've got UCLA hosting New Mexico on Saturday night, and honestly, this line has me scratching my head. The Bruins opened around -14. We're seeing it bounce between 13 and 15, depending where you shop. And, that feels light for what should be a massive talent disparity. Let me paint the picture here. New Mexico just squeaked by Idaho State, an FCS team, 28-22. And when I say squeaked by, I mean they were trailing in the fourth quarter before Skylar Humphrey bailed them out with a couple touchdown runs. Now, credit where it's due. Humphrey looked explosive with that 61-yard breakaway. But we're talking about a guy who transferred down from Montana State, putting up big numbers against Idaho State. UCLA, meanwhile, is coming off that brutal loss to UNLV where they got boat raced 27-20 in a game that wasn't even that close. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting for us as bettors. The Bruins were absolutely catastrophic in the first half, down 23-0, completely dominated. But then something clicked in the second half. They outscored UNLV 20-7 and looked like a completely different team. Now, you could say, well, they're just inconsistent, and yeah, that's probably true, but I'm wondering if there's something deeper here. New coach Deshaun Foster is still figuring out his rotation, still installing his system. The talent gap between these rosters is just enormous. We're talking about a Pac-12 program, even one that's struggling, versus a Mountain West team that needed a fourth-quarter comeback against an FCS opponent. The power rankings have this as nearly a 10-point discrepancy with the betting market. That's significant. The computers see UCLA as a 24-point favorite based on pure talent evaluation, but Vegas has this at 14. Either the sharps know something about UCLA's current state that the models don't capture, or we're looking at legitimate value on the Bruins. Here's what concerns me about New Mexico, though. They gave up 22 points to Idaho State, 22 to an FCS team. And it's not like they were just cruising and took their foot off the gas. Idaho State actually took the lead in the fourth quarter. The Lobos' defense looked completely lost at times, and that was against a significantly inferior opponent. UCLA's offense, for all its first-half struggles against UNLV, still has Pac-12 caliber athletes. Nico Iamaleava threw for 255 yards despite the chaos, and when they got their act together in the second half, they moved the ball pretty effectively. Against New Mexico's defense, if Idaho State can put up 22. But then there's the penalties. 14 accepted flags for 129 yards against UNLV. That's not just undisciplined play, that's almost sabotage. Foster's got to clean that up, and fast. You can't spot teams that many free yards and expect to cover double-digit spreads. The situational stuff is interesting too. New Mexico's making a 660-mile trip on a short week, while UCLA gets an extra day of rest. Home field advantage at the Rose Bowl is only worth about 2 points according to the models, so it's not like the Bruins get a massive boost from the venue. But every little bit helps when you're trying to cover 14. Weather looks perfect. 58 degrees at kickoff, Basically no wind, zero precipitation. So we can throw out any concerns about conditions affecting the passing game or kicking game. Look, I keep coming back to this talent disparity. UCLA has 4- and 5-star recruits across the roster. New Mexico is New Mexico. They're a program that's been irrelevant in the Mountain West for years, and their best offensive showing this season came against Idaho State. I think the market is overreacting to UCLA's slow start and undervaluing just how bad New Mexico looked, even in a win. The Bruins' second-half adjustments against UNLV showed they can execute when they're focused, and this feels like a classic spot for a struggling power conference team to take out their frustrations on an overmatched opponent. So we've got Syracuse hosting Colgate this weekend, and honestly, this one's shaping up to be fascinating for all the wrong reasons if you're a Syracuse bettor. Let me walk you through what I'm seeing here, because the Orange just came off that wild overtime win against UConn that told us a lot about who this team really is, and it wasn't all good news. Steve Angeli threw for 417 yards in that game, which sounds impressive until you realize he was getting absolutely hammered behind that offensive line. 3 sacks, 7 tackles for loss allowed. I mean, this O-line is becoming a serious problem. Their starting left tackle, Trevion Mack, got banged up, and without him, they managed a whopping 23 rushing yards in the first half against UConn. But here's what's interesting. Angeli showed some real clutch gene stuff late. That 53-yard touchdown bomb to Ross Simmons, then the game winner in overtime. The kid can deliver when the lights are brightest. That's actually huge for future betting considerations because we know Syracuse is probably going to be in some close games this year. The red zone stuff, though? That's where I'm getting concerned. They had multiple chances inside the 10-yard line against UConn and came away with field goals. 2 fourth-down failures inside the 10. Against Colgate, sure, maybe that doesn't matter, but this is a pattern that better teams are going to exploit. Now, Dan Villari at tight end has been a pleasant surprise. 12 catches in 2 games, 7 for 104 yards against UConn. With the offensive line struggling, having a reliable safety valve could be the difference between Syracuse covering spreads or leaving bettors frustrated. Here's my thing, though, and this is where it gets really interesting for FCS matchups like this. Power rankings suggest this should be a massive blowout. Syracuse has a 2.7-point home field advantage, which is actually above average, and they're facing an FCS opponent off a short week. But remember what happened late against UConn. Syracuse's defense, which played pretty well overall, still allowed UConn to march down and tie it with under a minute left. If you can't close out UConn at home, what does that tell us about your killer instinct against overmatched opponents? Weather's going to be perfect. 55 degrees at kickoff, minimal wind, dry conditions. Classic fall football weather that won't impact the game at all. So here's where my head's at. Syracuse should win this easily on paper, but this offensive line is so banged up that even Colgate might be able to create some pressure. And if Syracuse gets up big early, which they should, are they going to keep their foot on the gas? Or are we looking at another slow start team that makes games closer than they need to be? The bet that makes sense to me if there was a line available would probably be the under. Syracuse's red zone issues mean they might settle for field goals, even against weaker competition. And Colgate, they're probably not lighting up the scoreboard in the Dome. But honestly, the real value here is what this game tells us about Syracuse moving forward. If they struggle to dominate Colgate, even if they win, that offensive line problem is going to be a major fade spot when they get back into ACC play. So we've got Colorado heading down to Houston on Friday night, and there's a fascinating disconnect between what the power rankings are telling us and what the betting market thinks about this game. The models have Colorado at the real edge here. We're talking about 4.5 points of value on the Buffs, which is that significant disagreement between the sharps and the books. Now let me walk you through why this line might be off. Colorado just bounced back beautifully from that Georgia Tech loss, putting up 31 on Delaware with, and this is the interesting part, a 3-quarterback rotation that actually worked. Ryan Staub got hot, went 7 of 10 for 157 and 2 touchdowns, leading 4 drives that resulted in 21 points. But here's what I'm watching. Coach Prime is keeping his cards close to his chest about who's getting the start Friday. He's not tipping his hand, which could be strategic brilliance or It could create some uncertainty heading into conference play. The offensive balance looked good against Delaware. 9 different receivers caught passes. Sincere Brown had that explosive 71-yard touchdown. But Delaware isn't Houston. And that brings us to the Cougars' side of this equation. Houston's got some real weapons that didn't get tested much against Rice. Connor Weigman showed he can hurt you with his arm and his legs. 188 passing, plus that rushing touchdown. And Dean Connors, the transfer running back, just gashed Rice for 132 yards on 13 carries. 54-yard run, 42-yard run. The guy's got that big play ability that can flip a game in a hurry. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Houston's pattern of slow starts. They only led Rice 7-3 at halftime, then turned it on in the second half. Against better competition like Colorado, you can't afford to sleepwalk through the first 30 minutes and expect to just flip a switch. Situational stuff matters here too. Both teams are coming off short weeks. Colorado's making that 900-mile trip. Not ideal. And they're dealing with the time zone change. Meanwhile, Houston gets to stay home, but their home field advantage is below average at just 2 points. So it's not like they're getting a massive boost from playing at home. And then there's the weather factor that nobody's really talking about. We're looking at 82 degrees at kickoff, but with 83% humidity. That's brutal. Colorado's coming from altitude in Colorado where it's dry, and now they're stepping into this Houston sauna. That could be a real factor in the fourth quarter if this game stays close. The defensive matchups are where I think this gets decided. Colorado's defense showed some life against Delaware. 2 turnovers, blocked a punt, stopped them on downs twice. But Houston's defense against Rice? 3 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, and Will James had that 37-yard pick six. Both defenses can create short fields and extra possessions. Here's my read on the value. The power rankings suggesting Colorado should be favored by nearly a field goal while they're getting points in the market? That's a pretty strong signal. Houston might have the home field in the revenge narrative from last year, but Colorado's got more talent, more depth, and if Deion can navigate this quarterback situation correctly, more upside. The question becomes whether Houston's home cooking and Colorado's travel fatigue matter more than pure talent evaluation. With a line this far off from the power rankings, I'm leaning toward trusting the numbers over the narrative. Alright, so Kansas State just got embarrassed by Army in their opener, and now they're flying cross-country on a short week to face an Arizona team that just hung 59 points on Weber State. But here's the thing. This spread is telling a completely different story than what most people are going to see on the surface. Kansas State opened as 14-point road favorites, and that's not a misprint. The books are essentially saying that Army loss was fool's gold, and I think they might be right. Look, losing to Army happens. It's a weird system, triple option. Keeps you on the field for 41 minutes while you watch helplessly. But the underlying issues for K-State, they're fixable. Dylan Edwards got hurt on literally his first touch. Without him, they managed 75 rushing yards on 18 carries. That's not a systemic problem. That's a personnel problem that should be resolved by Friday night. The red zone struggles? Yeah, settling for field goals instead of touchdowns kept it close, but that's more about execution than scheme. Now, Arizona. Noah Fafita threw for 373 and 5 touchdowns, completed his first 14 attempts. Sounds impressive, right? But we're talking about Weber State here. This is the same Arizona team that needed a late surge to beat New Mexico in Week 1, where Fafita threw for 161 yards on 13 of 23 passing. Here's what's really interesting. The power rankings have Kansas State as a significantly stronger team. We're talking about a 13.9 disagreement between the models and the betting market. That's massive. Either the books know something the computers don't, or there's serious value here. The situational stuff actually favors Kansas State more than you'd think. Yeah, they're on the road, making a 900-mile trip with a 2-hour time adjustment. But Arizona's playing on a short week after a Saturday night game that included a weather delay. K-State gets normal rest while Arizona's scrambling to prepare for a huge step up in competition. And let's talk about that Arizona defense for a second. Sure, they dominated Weber State, held them to 184 total yards. But Weber State's offense isn't exactly setting the world on fire. Kansas State's got real talent. When healthy, they can move the ball against anybody. The penalty issues for Arizona are concerning too. 10 penalties for 80 yards, including 2 rushing touchdowns wiped out, and their linebacker getting ejected for targeting. Against Weber State, what happens when they're facing actual pressure from a quality opponent? Here's my read on this game. Arizona's at home. They've got some juice from that offensive explosion last week, and the public's going to remember Kansas State getting boat raced by Army. But the books aren't stupid. They're laying this big number for a reason. The elevation in Tucson is minimal. 2,400 feet won't matter much. Weather's going to be perfect, around 80 degrees at kickoff. Wind's basically a non-factor. So we're looking at a clean environment where talent should prevail. Kansas State's defensive issues against Army's time-consuming drives, that's not going to translate to Arizona. The Wildcats don't run that methodical ground game. They're going to try to get vertical with Fafita, and that plays right into K-State's hands if their secondary is healthy. The real question is whether Kansas State can establish any kind of ground game without Edwards. If they can't and Arizona jumps out early, this could get ugly fast. But if Edwards is back, or if they found a way to manufacture rushing yards, this line feels like it's begging you to take the home underdog. I keep coming back to that power ranking disagreement. 13.9 is not a small discrepancy. That suggests either the market is completely wrong about Kansas State's talent level, or there's some inside information that hasn't gone public yet. My gut says Kansas State's got too much talent to lay an egg 2 weeks in a row, especially with normal preparation time. Arizona's penalties short week, and the fact that they needed a late surge against New Mexico in week 1, there are warning signs if you're looking for them. This feels like one of those spots where the public's going to be all over the home dog that just scored 59 points, while the sharp money finds its way to Kansas State. The books didn't hang 14 just to give away free money. So, we've got Fresno State hosting Southern tonight, and honestly, this one's got all the makings of a letdown spot for the Bulldogs. Let me walk you through why this might not be the blowout everyone's expecting. First off, Southern just traveled 1,695 miles with a 2-hour time adjustment. That's brutal for any team. But here's the thing. Sometimes these massive travel spots create weird energy. Teams either come out completely flat, or they play with this nothing-to-lose mentality that catches favorites off guard. Now, the power rankings have Fresno State in complete blowout territory. We're talking about a legitimate mismatch between a top-tier team and what the numbers say is a bottom-tier opponent. Add in Fresno State's strong home field advantage of 2.6, which is well above the usual home boost. And you think this is a lock, right? But here's where I start getting nervous if I'm laying big points. Fresno State's coming off that wild 36-27 win where they got outgained 528 to 318 yards. Think about that for a second. They won by 9 while being absolutely dominated statistically. Sure, they show clutch factor. Dylan Lynch nailed 3 fourth-quarter field goals, including that game winner from 43 yards with 29 seconds left. Jakari Embree's 45-yard pick six sealed it. Classic bend-don't-break stuff, but that's not sustainable against every opponent. E.J. Warner did his thing with 121 passing and 57 rushing with a touchdown, and Rayshawn Luke broke that explosive 44-yarder. So they can create big plays, no question. But when you're getting outgained by over 200 yards and still winning, that screams regression coming. The weather's perfect. 67 degrees at kickoff, winds under 10 miles per hour, 0 precipitation, so we can throw out any weather equalizer narratives. Here's my read on this spot. Fresno State's riding high after that comeback win, but they might be overlooking a Southern team that has absolutely nothing to lose. When you travel that far, you either pack it in completely or you come out swinging because, hey, what's the worst that happens? The Bulldogs showed they can win ugly, but relying on late-game heroics and defensive touchdowns isn't a formula for covering big spreads. If Southern comes out with any life at all, and road dogs in these situations sometimes do, this could stay interesting longer than people think. I'm not saying take Southern, but I am saying Fresno State's recent win might be masking some underlying issues. When you win despite being thoroughly outplayed, that's usually more concerning than encouraging for your next outing. So here we are, the first weekend of October, and we've got what should be a fascinating collision of narratives when Vanderbilt heads down to Columbia to face number 10 South Carolina. And honestly, when I started digging into this matchup, the more I looked, the more I realized we might be staring at one of those classic the market knows something we don't situations. Let me paint you the picture here. South Carolina is sitting pretty at number 10 in the polls, They're getting almost 3 points of home field advantage, which is actually above average. And yet the power rankings are screaming that this line should be closer to 17 points, not the 6.5 we're seeing. That's nearly 11 points of disagreement between the sharps who set these power rankings and what the betting market is telling us. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Vanderbilt just pulled off something genuinely impressive against Virginia Tech. I'm talking about trailing by 10 at halftime, then coming out in the third quarter and scoring touchdowns on their first 5 possessions. 5 straight touchdown drives to start the second half. That's not luck, that's execution under pressure. Diego Pavia was surgical in that comeback, 12 of 18 for 193 yards, including a 54-yard bomb to Bryson Coleman when they needed it most. But here's what really caught my eye about that Vandy performance. They rushed for 262 yards and completely took over the game on the ground. Cedric Alexander punched in 2 fourth-quarter rushing touchdowns, and by the end, Virginia Tech managed just 21 total yards in the entire second half. 21 yards. That's the kind of defensive dominance that travels. Now flip the script and look at South Carolina's last outing. Yeah, they beat South Carolina State, but this was troubling. Lenoris Sellers completed 2 of his first 8 passes and finished with just 128 yards passing against an FCS team. The offense managed only 253 total yards, and honestly, without Vakari Swain returning 2 punts for touchdowns, 64 and 42 yards, this could have been genuinely embarrassing for a top 10 team. Shane Beamer said it himself after the game, "We can't rely on defense and special teams to score 3 touchdowns a game." That's your head coach essentially admitting his offense has an identity crisis heading into SEC play. So here's my read on this market disagreement. The power rankings are looking at South Carolina's talent level, their recruiting classes, their ceiling when everything clicks. But the betting market? The betting market is looking at Diego Pavia completing 78% of his passes in a hostile comeback, at Vanderbilt's defense shutting out Virginia Tech for 30 minutes straight, and at South Carolina's offense looking completely lost against inferior competition. There's also this wrinkle. Vanderbilt's coming off a short week with that -1 hour time adjustment, but honestly, that's barely worth mentioning compared to the momentum and confidence factors at play here. The weather's going to be perfect. 69 degrees at kickoff, basically no wind, no precipitation. So we can't lean on any external factors to explain away what should be pure football. Look, I'm not saying Vanderbilt's going to waltz into Williams-Brice Stadium and boat race the Gamecocks. But when you've got an 11-point market disagreement, when you've got a Commodores team that just proved they can execute under the brightest lights against a Gamecock squad that struggled to move the ball against anyone recently, well, that 6.5 points starts looking pretty generous. The real question isn't whether South Carolina has more talent. They do. It's whether they can actually put that talent to use when Vanderbilt comes in with nothing to lose and everything to prove. And based on what we saw last weekend, that's far from guaranteed. So here's the thing about this Middle Tennessee at Nevada matchup. The market is telling us one story, but the power rankings are screaming something completely different. We've got Middle Tennessee as 6-point underdogs, but when you dig into the actual team strength metrics, these squads are basically dead even. Nevada's got the slightest edge, maybe half a point, on a neutral field. That's a massive disconnect. We're talking 6.5 points of potential value on Middle Tennessee here. Now, I get why the market's skeptical of the Blue Raiders. They just got throttled by Wisconsin, giving up 28 unanswered points over the final 22 minutes. But here's what that film actually shows. Middle Tennessee outgained Wisconsin 117-42 in the first quarter. They were moving the ball, they were in the game. The problem wasn't talent. It was execution in the red zone and some brutal self-inflicted wounds. Nicholas Vattiato looked solid under center, 20 of 31 for 197 yards. The arm strength's there, the accuracy's there, but they left points all over the field, settling for a field goal from first and goal at the 4, punting from Wisconsin's 35 after a trick play penalty. Classic case of beating yourself. Meanwhile, Nevada barely survived Sacramento State 20-17. Yeah, they got a clutch pick 6 from Jonathan Maldonado with 2 minutes left, but this was Sacramento State we're talking about. The Wolfpack rushed for 268 yards, which sounds impressive until you realize they only threw for 144. Chubba Purdy's dual threat ability is real. 115 rushing yards on 22 carries, but he also threw 2 picks. Here's where it gets interesting. Nevada's running game strength should play right into Middle Tennessee's hands. The Blue Raiders' biggest issue against Wisconsin wasn't stopping the run early. It was maintaining that defensive intensity after momentum swings. But if Nevada's going to lean heavy on Purdy's legs and a ground game that's somewhat predictable, that gives Middle Tennessee's defense a chance to key in on what's coming. The situational stuff matters too. We're talking about an 1,800-mile trip for Middle Tennessee, 2-hour time adjustment, 4,600 feet of elevation. That's real. But you know what? Sometimes these cross-country dogs come out and punch you in the mouth because nobody expects them to compete. Nevada's home field advantage is only worth 2 points according to the metrics. That's below average. So even accounting for the travel and elevation, we're still looking at Middle Tennessee getting way too many points. The weather's going to be perfect. 53 degrees at kickoff, light winds from the west-southwest. No excuses there. This comes down to which team executes better. And I'm not convinced Nevada's significantly better at that than Middle Tennessee. Look, if you believe the market, Nevada should cruise here. But if you trust the power rankings and think Middle Tennessee learned something from that Wisconsin collapse, 6 points feels like a gift. The Blue Raiders have the talent to hang around, and in a game between 2 evenly matched teams, that's usually enough to cover. So, we've got Arkansas heading into Oxford on Saturday night, and the market's telling us one story while the power rankings are screaming something completely different. Ole Miss is laying 6.5 points at home, but here's the thing. The analytics suggest this line should be closer to 11.5. That's a massive 5-point gap, and when you see that kind of disagreement between the market and the models, you've got to ask yourself, what does Vegas know that we don't? Let's start with what Arkansas showed us last week. Taylor Green put up 420 total yards against Arkansas State, 269 through the air, 151 on the ground, 5 total touchdowns. The kid's got 10 touchdown passes through just 2 games, which is, well, it's explosive stuff. But here's what caught my eye. They averaged 11.1 yards per rush. 11.1! That's not sustainable against SEC defenses, but it shows you the kind of big play ability this offense has. Now, the concerning part for Arkansas? Green threw 2 picks in the first half. Against Arkansas State. If he's making those mistakes against Sun Belt competition, what happens when Ole Miss brings pressure with guys who can actually finish? Speaking of Ole Miss, they just went into Lexington and beat Kentucky 24-17. Austin Simmons threw for 235 yards, but he also tossed 2 early interceptions that put them in a 10-0 hole. Sound familiar? The difference is Simmons bounced back. That's the kind of mental toughness you need in the SEC. Here's where this gets interesting from a betting perspective. Ole Miss has accumulated 1,150 yards of total offense through 2 games. Their ground game with Kewan Lacey, 138 yards last week, gives them balance. But they're also sloppy. 7 penalties for 86 yards against Kentucky. That's the kind of stuff that'll kill you against a desperate Arkansas team. And make no mistake, Arkansas is desperate. This is their SEC opener. They're coming off a 56-14 blowout where everything went right, and now they're walking into one of the toughest road environments in college football. Vaught Hemingway gets loud, especially for night games. The power rankings love Ole Miss here, and honestly, I can see why. Their home field advantage is rated at 2.9 points, which is well above average. Lane Kiffin's teams typically show up in big spots at home. But that 5-point disagreement with the market, that's what's keeping me up at night. What if Arkansas's ground game travels better than we think? What if Green's dual threat ability creates the kind of chaos that makes this a shootout? The over-under sits at 58.5, and with both quarterbacks capable of explosive plays and both defenses showing some leaky tendencies, I'm starting to think the total might be the better play here. But if I'm being honest, that Ole Miss power ranking edge combined with home field has me leaning toward the Rebels laying the points. Sometimes the model sees something the market's missing, and sometimes the market's just being cute with a big number on a team that looked dominant last week. Arkansas showed they can move the ball, but moving it against Arkansas State and moving it in Oxford on Saturday night, those are 2 very different things. So Michigan's getting nearly 11 points of value according to the power rankings, and honestly, that's where this whole conversation needs to start. When you see that big of a gap between what the models think and what Vegas is offering, you've got to ask yourself, what does the market know that we don't? Central Michigan comes in off a pretty telling loss at Pittsburgh, where they actually played it close for a while. The three-quarterback rotation thing is interesting, I guess. Joe Labus, Jaden Glasser, and Angel Flores combined to go 20 of 27 for 177 yards. That's efficient, sure, but it screams we don't trust anyone to actually take over this offense. And when you're facing Michigan's defense next, good luck with that committee approach. Here's what caught my attention, though. Central Michigan controlled the ball for 36 minutes against Pitt and still lost. That's their whole identity, right? Keep it close. Grind out long drives. Hope the other team makes mistakes. But here's the problem with that strategy. It only works if you can actually finish drives. They got within 7 points twice against Pittsburgh and couldn't capitalize either time. That's not skiing, that's execution. And execution doesn't magically improve against better competition. Now let's talk about Michigan, because this is where it gets really interesting from a betting perspective. Bryce Underwood looked completely overwhelmed in that Oklahoma game, 9 of 24 for 142 yards. The coaching staff clearly didn't trust him, and you could see it in how conservative they got. But here's the thing, that was on the road in a hostile environment against a pretty good Oklahoma defense. This week, they're at home against Central Michigan, and Justice Haynes just ran for 125 yards and a 75-yard touchdown against the Sooners. That's his third 50-plus yard run this season already. When you've got a running back who can break one at any moment and you're facing a MAC defense that just gave up over 400 yards to Pittsburgh, the weather's going to be perfect too. 82 degrees, light winds from the southwest at about 10 miles per hour. Nothing that's going to slow down Michigan's rushing attack or make field goals dicey. But back to that power ranking discrepancy, because this is really the crux of the whole bet. Michigan's getting a 2.7 home field advantage, which is actually above average. So you're looking at a team that the models think should be laying nearly 11 points more than they actually are, playing at home, against a team that just showed they can't close out winnable games on the road. I mean, Central Michigan's whole approach is basically hoping Michigan beats itself, keep the ball, control the clock, pray for turnovers. And yeah, Jordan Kwiatkowski did pick off a pass against Pittsburgh, but they also gave up 2 quick scores right after getting within striking distance. That's the definition of fool's gold, creating hope just to crush it immediately. The one thing that gives me pause here is Michigan's offensive line issues. Underwood was under pressure constantly against Oklahoma, and if they can't protect him better, this could turn into more of a grinded-out game than Michigan wants. But honestly, against Central Michigan's defense, even a struggling offensive line should be able to create enough holes for Haynes to do damage. So when you step back and look at this whole thing, you've got a Michigan team that the models love, playing at home, against a team whose entire game plan revolves around hoping their opponent doesn't execute. That power ranking edge of nearly 11 points? That's not just noise. That's the difference between a team with real talent and a team trying to punch above its weight class. The market's basically giving you Central Michigan at a discount because of Michigan's road struggles, but this is a completely different situation. Home environment, better matchup, and a running game that can take pressure off their struggling quarterback. So we've got Clemson rolling into Atlanta as 8.5-point favorites against Georgia Tech, and let me tell you something. This line feels way off when you dig into what actually happened in these teams' last games. Clemson just survived a massive scare at home against Troy. We're talking about a team that was 31-point favorites, trailing 16-3 at halftime to a Group of 5 school. That's not just concerning, that's alarming. They managed only 114 yards in the first half, committed 2 turnovers, and looked completely out of sync. Sure, they flipped the script after halftime and outscored Troy 24-0, but here's the thing. You shouldn't need a 16-point comeback against Troy when you're ranked in the top 25. Meanwhile, Georgia Tech is coming off what might be the most impressive road win nobody's talking about. Haynes King went absolutely nuclear in Colorado. 156 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, plus 143 through the air. That 45-yard game-winning touchdown run with just over a minute left? That's the kind of clutch performance that defines seasons. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings have Clemson in that dominant team tier, and there's apparently 8 8/10 points of value on the Tigers, according to the models. That's a massive disagreement between the sharp money and the analytics. When you see that kind of split, somebody's wrong. Now, I'll give you the counter-argument on Georgia Tech. They turned the ball over 3 times on their first 3 possessions against Colorado. 3 turnovers on 3 drives after having only 10 all last season. That's not sustainable, and it nearly cost them what should have been a comfortable win. But here's what's really catching my attention. Georgia Tech rushed for 320 yards total and controlled that game once they settled down. They outgained Colorado 463 to 305 and showed they can impose their will on the ground. That's exactly the kind of game script that can keep you in a fight against a more talented team. And speaking of Clemson's talent advantage, where is it exactly? Antonio Williams, their leading receiver with 75 catches for 904 yards last season, is out with a hamstring injury. Safety Khalil Barnes is also nursing a hamstring issue, and left tackle Tristan Lee is banged up. When you're already struggling to move the ball in first halves, losing your top playmaker is a massive blow. The situational spot here is fascinating too. Clemson just got embarrassed on national television in their home opener, the kind of performance that gets coaches asking hard questions all week in practice. But Georgia Tech? They just pulled off their first regular season win in Mountain Time since 1978. The confidence levels heading into this game couldn't be more different. Here's my read on this game. Clemson's probably the better team on paper, but 8.5 points is asking them to not just win but dominate a Georgia Tech squad that just showed they can move the ball at will when Haynes King is cooking. The Yellow Jackets rush for over 300 yards, control the clock, and even if they don't win outright, they're going to make this a dogfight. The weather's perfect. 91 degrees at kickoff, minimal wind, no precipitation concerns. So we're not dealing with any external factors that might slow down Georgia Tech's ground attack or favor either team's passing game. When I look at this line, I see a Clemson team getting too much respect for a brand name and not enough scrutiny for what they actually showed us against Troy. Meanwhile, Georgia Tech is getting zero credit for going on the road and taking down a decent Colorado team in dramatic fashion. Sometimes the market overcorrects, and I think that's exactly what's happening here. So here's what's fascinating about this Memphis-Troy matchup. We've got 2 teams coming off completely different types of performances that tell us everything we need to know about where the value is tonight. Memphis just put together one of those games that shows you exactly what kind of team they are. Yeah, they were only up 17-16 at halftime against Georgia State. But here's the thing. They came out in the second half and absolutely steamrolled them, outscoring them 21-0. That's not lucky. That's coaching. That's adjustments. That's a team that knows how to close. And the way they did it? 2 methodical drives in the third quarter, each one eating up over 5 minutes of clock. That's ball control at its finest. When Memphis gets a lead, they don't just sit on it. They suffocate you with it. Now flip that script and look at Troy. Here's a team that went into Death Valley and had number 8 Clemson on the ropes. 16-0 at halftime. Goose Crowder was dealing, throwing for 223 yards, hitting Trey Taylor for a 44-yard touchdown on the opening drive. They looked like world beaters. But then the second half happened. 24-0. Clemson didn't just come back. They ran Troy over like a freight train, and it wasn't close. 3 turnovers, 10 penalties for 95 yards, and a defense that completely collapsed when it mattered most. Here's what really gets me about Troy's performance. They allowed 103 rushing yards in the second half alone after shutting down Clemson's ground game early. That's not just bad luck, that's a team that can't maintain their level when the pressure builds. The betting market has Memphis laying around 3.5, and honestly, that feels light. The power ranking suggests Memphis should be favored by more than 4 points here, even accounting for Troy's below-average home field advantage of just 2.4 points. Look, I get it. Troy showed they can hang with elite competition for 30 minutes, but Memphis showed something more valuable. They know how to finish. They've got Makari Bodeford punching in touchdowns from short yardage, DeMarco Ward picking off passes and taking them to the house. That's his second pick 6 in 2 games, and an offensive attack that's getting contributions from multiple guys. The weather's perfect, so we don't have any external factors muddying the waters. This comes down to execution and depth, and Memphis has shown they can maintain their standard for a full 60 minutes, while Troy, well, they haven't. The total's sitting around 52.5, and with both offenses capable of moving the ball, Memphis averaging over 38 points through 2 games, and Troy showing they can score against anyone, I'm leaning over, especially if this becomes a track meet early and Troy has to abandon their ball control approach. But the real play here, Memphis minus 3.5, feels like free money. Troy's going to need everything to break right for them tonight, and teams that blow 16-point leads to top 10 opponents usually don't bounce back that quickly against another quality opponent. So, here's what we've got cooking in Canton, Ohio today. Buffalo rolling into MAC play after absolutely demolishing an FCS opponent, while Kent State well, they're trying to forget what happened against Texas Tech. And the market's got this all wrong. Let me paint you the picture of what went down last week. Buffalo hung 62 on St. Francis. Yeah, that's nice, but we're talking about an FCS team that managed a whopping 126 total yards. Meanwhile, Kent State got boat raced by Texas Tech 62-14, and it wasn't even that close. But here's the thing everyone's missing. Kent State's offensive line had a center with a snap that literally stayed on the ground. Their punter had a knee down while catching the snap. These aren't talent issues. These are basic execution problems that, honestly, you'd expect to see cleaned up against the MAC opponent at home. Now, Buffalo looked explosive with Taquan Roberson accounting for 3 touchdowns, but, and this is important, he completed only 50% of his passes and threw a pick. Against St. Francis, that's not exactly lighting the world on fire from an accuracy standpoint. Here's where it gets interesting for bettors. The power rankings have Buffalo as a dominant tier team, but Kent State is getting 5.8 points of value according to the model disagreement. That's significant. Plus, we're looking at below-average home field advantage for Kent State at just 2 points, which actually helps explain why this spread might be inflated. The narrative everyone's buying is simple. Buffalo dominated, Kent State got destroyed, therefore Buffalo should cruise. But, let's dig deeper on that Kent State performance. Yeah, they had negative total yards until their 6th possession, but once they got their legs under them, quarterback Drew DeShields showed some real fight in the 4th quarter. 2 touchdowns against Texas Tech's backup, sure, but he was moving the ball. And here's what's really telling. Kent State hung with Merrimack 21-17 in their opener. That's not a great win, but it shows they can play competitive football when the talent gap isn't massive. The weather's going to be perfect. 84 degrees, 3-mile-per-hour winds, completely dry. No edge there for either side. So where's the value? Well, Buffalo's going to be heavily bet because of that 62-point explosion. But smart money knows you can't extrapolate FCS beatdowns to MAC play. Kent State's getting points at home in their conference opener, desperate to bounce back, and they've got a quarterback who showed some moxie when given the chance. The execution errors from last week, those get fixed at home against a team they can actually compete with. Buffalo's passing game concerns, those become real problems when they can't just run over inferior athletes. I'm not saying Kent State wins outright, but this spread feels about 4 points too high based on the actual talent differential. Sometimes the market overreacts to blowouts, and sometimes that creates opportunity. All right, let's talk about this Baylor-Samford matchup, and honestly, this is one of those spots where the story isn't really about the game itself. It's about what we can learn about Baylor moving forward. First off, Sawyer Robertson is absolutely cooking right now. 3 straight 400-yard games? That's elite company we're talking about. Only the 4th Big 12 quarterback in 15 years to pull that off. Through 2 games, he's got 850-plus yards, 7 touchdowns, 0 picks. Those are video game numbers. And here's the thing. This kid's doing it against real competition, not just cupcakes. But what really caught my eye from that Utah comeback was the mental toughness. Trailing by 10 points 4 different times, down 38-24 with 8 minutes left. Most teams fold there. Baylor scored 14 in the final 5 minutes just to get to overtime. That's not luck. That's clutch execution when everything's on the line. Now, about this Samford game. Look, the Bears are going to win by however much they want to. 616 miles Samford's traveling to get absolutely worked by a team that just hung 601 yards on a ranked opponent. The power rankings have this as an extreme mismatch, and that's probably underselling it. Here's where it gets interesting for us, though. Baylor's home field advantage is only 2.4 points. That's well below average. So even at home, they don't get the typical boost most teams see. But against an FCS opponent, doesn't matter. The weather's actually worth mentioning here. 96 degrees at kickoff with 15-mile-per-hour winds throughout the day. During the game, expect 11-mile-per-hour winds from the south-southeast, gusting up to 13. That's going to mess with kicking games, which gives a definite edge to run-first teams. And with zero precipitation expected, we're looking at dry conditions but some serious wind variance. What I'm really watching for is how Baylor uses this game. Do they keep Robertson sharp with his passing rhythm, or do they protect him for Big 12 play? Because that aerial attack, Hawkins with 10 catches for 145, Cameron with 9 for 151 and 2 scores, Prentice chipping in 4 for 63 and 2 touchdowns. That's a balanced receiving core that can create problems for conference opponents. The real value here isn't in betting this blowout, it's in understanding what Baylor's become under pressure. They bounced back from that Auburn disappointment, showed they can execute in crunch time, and Robertson's playing at a level we rarely see. When they get back into Big 12 play, that's a team that's going to be severely undervalued by the market. Because here's the thing, teams that can come back from multiple 10-point deficits don't just get lucky. That's systematic execution, and it usually translates when the games start mattering again. So, Virginia's coming off what might be one of the most frustrating losses you'll see all season. They had NC State right where they wanted them, 10 points up, converting 10 of their first 13 third downs like a machine. Then, the wheels just fell off. Here's what's really concerning for the Cavaliers moving forward. It wasn't talent that failed them. Jamari Taylor ran for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns. Chandler Morris threw for 257 with solid accuracy. But when crunch time hit, they couldn't convert a 4th and 1 at the NC State 8-yard line with under 7 minutes left. Game ends with Morris throwing a pick in the end zone. That's not just bad luck. That's a pattern. Virginia hasn't beaten NC State since 2012. Think about that for a second. 12 years of losing to the same program. When you dig into those fourth-quarter numbers, they managed just 3 conversions on 6 third-down attempts after dominating early. That's not fatigue, that's mental. Now they get William & Mary at home, and this is where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings show an extreme mismatch here. We're talking about an ACC program that just hung 257 passing yards on NC State facing an FCS opponent. But here's the thing about these spots. Efficiency metrics get weird when the talent gap is this massive. Virginia's home field advantage is actually below average at just 2 points, which is unusual for a Power 5 program. Most teams get closer to 3 or 4 at home. So even with this inflated line, and trust me, it's gonna be inflated, you're not getting the typical home boost that masks other issues. What worries me is the execution under pressure. William & Mary isn't going to have the athletes to hang with Virginia for 4 quarters. But can the Cavaliers actually finish? We saw them dominate situationally early against NC State, then completely collapse when the game was on the line. The weather's going to be perfect, 83 degrees, light winds from the south-southeast at 6 miles per hour, 0 precipitation. No excuses there. This should be a get-right game for Virginia, a chance to work on those red zone issues and fourth-quarter execution that cost them against the Wolfpack. But I keep coming back to that psychological profile. 12 years without beating NC State, failed 4th and 1 in scoring position. Interception in the end zone to lose the game. Those aren't scheme problems. Those are clutch problems. And while William & Mary might not have the talent to expose that, you better believe Virginia's next few ACC opponents are taking notes. The smart money here isn't just about the talent gap. It's about whether Tony Elliott can get his team to play with the same aggression and confidence they showed in the first half against NC State for a full 60 minutes. So we've got Maryland hosting Towson this weekend, and while this looks like a massive mismatch on paper, there's actually some fascinating betting angles lurking beneath the surface that most people are going to miss. Let's start with what's really going on with this Maryland team. They've allowed just 16 points through 2 games. That's their fewest since 2001. But here's the thing that caught my eye. Their defensive improvement isn't just about better players, it's about fixing their biggest weakness from last year. The secondary was getting torched in man coverage all season, and now they just held Northern Illinois to 91 passing yards. That's not an accident. And then there's freshman quarterback Malik Washington. This kid threw a 42-yard touchdown on 4th and 5 late in the game against NIU in his second college start. That's not just talent, that's the clutch gene. When you see a young quarterback making plays like that under pressure, it tells you something about his ceiling. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. Maryland's sitting on this 17-game winning streak against non-conference opponents, longest active streak in the country. That's not luck, that's a pattern. Coach Loxley's team show up prepared against unfamiliar opponents, and they execute when they're supposed to handle business. Now, the power rankings are screaming extreme mismatch here, which makes sense. FCS Towson versus Big Ten Maryland? Obviously. But here's what the sharp money knows. When you get these massive talent gaps, the betting market tends to overcorrect. The public sees Maryland and thinks easy money. But that line inflation can create some really weird value spots. What's also fascinating is Maryland's home field advantage. It's just 2.3 points, which is actually below average. So they're not getting the typical home boost you'd expect, which means their power ranking advantage has to do more of the heavy lifting. That's actually significant when you're trying to handicap these huge spreads. The weather's going to be perfect. 79 degrees, 6-mile-per-hour winds from the southeast. No excuses, no variables, just pure football execution. But here's my biggest concern with Maryland, and this is where Towson might have a puncher's chance to stay within whatever massive number this line opens at. The Terrapins' offense is still really inconsistent. They had a fumble inside the NIU 10-yard line, couldn't capitalize on great field position multiple times. When you're laying potentially 30-plus points, you can't afford those kinds of self-inflicted wounds. The thing about FCS versus FBS games is that the underdog doesn't need to be better. They just need the favorite to not execute perfectly. And Maryland's shown they can have those stretches where the offense just disappears. What I'm really watching for is whether Washington can build on that clutch performance, or if we see some of that freshman inconsistency creep in when the game's supposed to be easy. Because easy games, those are often when young quarterbacks make their biggest mistakes. So Nebraska just dropped 68 points on Akron last week, and now they're getting Houston Christian, a team that's making a 770-mile road trip to Lincoln. If you're looking at this game from a betting perspective, we need to talk about what's actually meaningful here and what's just noise. Dylan Raiola just set a Nebraska record with 20 consecutive completions spanning 2 games. The kid threw for 364 yards and 4 touchdowns against Akron. And here's the thing. This wasn't just stat padding against cupcakes. Well, okay, it was stat padding, but the efficiency was real. When a freshman quarterback is hitting passes at that clip, you're seeing legitimate development. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Nebraska's offensive explosion, 728 total yards, their most since 2014, came with Emmett Johnson racking up 140 rushing yards and 3 scores. That's back-to-back 100-yard games for Johnson, and it's creating this balanced attack that takes pressure off Raiola. Now, the defense pitched their first shutout in 15 years. 15 years! That's significant because it shows they can maintain intensity for 4 quarters while rotating players. The depth and conditioning we're seeing suggests this isn't just a flash in the pan. Here's what's tricky about handicapping this spot, though. Power rankings show an extreme mismatch, which usually means the betting market gets weird. The public sees Nebraska dropping 68 points and thinks easy money. But these massive spreads and mismatches can be tricky. The efficiency metrics we usually rely on, they become less reliable when you're facing vastly inferior competition. And speaking of advantages, Nebraska's home field is only worth about 2.3 points, which is below average. So they're not getting the typical home boost you'd expect, but honestly, against Houston Christian, does it matter? The weather's actually going to be a factor here. 18-mile-per-hour winds with gusts up to 19, coming from the south-southwest. That's significant wind that's going to affect the passing game and definitely impact kickers. In a game where Nebraska might be kicking a lot of extra points, that wind variance could create some interesting wrinkles. Temperatures sitting around 94 degrees at kickoff with low humidity, so the heat won't be a major factor. But those winds, they favor run-first teams, which plays right into what Nebraska wants to do anyway with Johnson's ground game. Look, Nebraska's riding an 8-game non-conference winning streak, their longest since '99 to 2001. They're clearly building something here, and this Houston Christian game is basically a tune-up before conference play starts. The real question isn't whether Nebraska wins big, it's whether this offensive explosion is sustainable, and if the defensive shutout was real improvement or just Akron being terrible. With no betting line available yet, we're kind of flying blind on market expectations, but when it comes out, I'd expect it to be massive. The win's going to be the wild card here, potentially creating some variance in what should otherwise be a very controlled game for the Cornhuskers. So Alabama just dropped 73 points on Louisiana Monroe. And honestly, that might be the worst thing that could have happened to Wisconsin bettors this week. Look, I get it. When you see a team hang 7 touchdowns in the first half and then keep their foot on the gas, your first instinct is to think they're going to roll whoever's next. But here's the thing, and this is where the smart money usually lives. Wisconsin's walking into Bryant-Denny as a 16.5-point dog, and that number feels way too big for a team that just figured some things out. Let me paint you the picture of what actually happened last weekend. Wisconsin's starting quarterback Billy Edwards is still nursing that knee sprain, so they threw Danny O'Neal into his first career start. Kid goes 23 of 27 for 283 yards and 3 touchdowns, sets a program record for most passing yards by a first-time starter. Not exactly the recipe for a team that's about to get blown out by 3 scores. But here's where it gets interesting. Wisconsin's running game? Absolute disaster. 4 yards on their first 15 rushing attempts. Their 2 biggest rushing touchdowns came from wide receivers, a 61-yarder from Kekahuna and a 14-yarder from Anthony. So basically, their traditional ground attack was completely non-existent, yet they still put up 42 points and covered as a road favorite. Now, Alabama's defense will obviously present a much stiffer test, but think about this. If Wisconsin can move the ball through the air with an emergency quarterback making his first start, what happens when they've had a full week to prepare and build on that success? The other thing that jumped out from Wisconsin's game, they were only up 14-10 at halftime against Middle Tennessee. Then they had what Coach Luke Fickell called tough conversations at the break, and boom, outscored Middle Tennessee 28-0 over the final 22 minutes. That's not a team that folds under pressure. That's a team that figures it out. Meanwhile, Alabama's putting up video game numbers against Louisiana Monroe, and everyone's acting like they just solved world hunger. Don't get me wrong, Ty Simpson looked fantastic. Completed all 17 passes for 226 yards. But we're talking about a team that gave up 24 points to Florida State in Week 1 and needed some serious soul-searching after that performance. Here's my read on the power rankings telling us Alabama should be laying 13.3 while the market's got them at 16.5. That's over 3 points of disagreement, and in college football betting, that's massive. The market's overreacting to Alabama's blowout and probably undervaluing Wisconsin's ability to move the ball. Plus, Wisconsin just showed they can make second-half adjustments. Their defense forced that crucial 4th down stop at their own 23-yard line, completely flipped the momentum, and then they scored 4 straight touchdowns. That's the kind of situational execution that keeps you in games against superior talent. The weather's perfect, 92 degrees at kickoff, calm winds, no precipitation. So we're not dealing with any external factors that might favor the more physical team or create weird game flow issues. Look, I'm not saying Wisconsin wins this game straight up. Alabama's at home, they're the better team on paper, and Bryant-Denny's worth nearly 3 points of home field advantage. But 16.5 points? For a Wisconsin team that just discovered they can throw the football effectively with a quarterback nobody saw coming? The smart play here feels like taking the points with Wisconsin. Alabama might win, but they're going to have to earn every point against a team that's starting to figure out its identity on offense. So we've got Oklahoma traveling 1,261 miles to face Temple on Saturday, and honestly, the betting market is telling us a completely different story than what the numbers suggest. Here's what's fascinating about this matchup. Power rankings have Oklahoma as a massive favorite, like 6.8 points more than what the current spread suggests. That's a pretty significant disagreement between the sharps who build power ratings and the odds makers setting lines. When you see that kind of gap, it usually means one side is getting way too much respect or the other is being completely overlooked. Now, Oklahoma just pulled off this huge emotional win against Michigan. Players literally carrying Brent Venables off the field, John Mateer looking like he's finally the answer at quarterback with 270 yards passing, 74 rushing, 3 total touchdowns. But here's the thing that's bugging me about that performance. They're still -4 in turnover margin through 2 games. Yeah, they've been lucky, allowing just 6 points off those 4 turnovers. But that luck, it doesn't travel well. And speaking of travel, 1,200 miles with a 1-hour time adjustment isn't nothing. Oklahoma's coming off this massive emotional high. Now they've got to get on a plane, deal with the logistics, and Temple's sitting there at home with their first back-to-back win since 2021. Temple put up 560 yards against Howard, which, okay, is Howard, but the efficiency was ridiculous. 9 of their first 11 possessions ended in scores. Evan Simon went 8 for 10. Giovanni McCoy was perfect at 6 for 6 when he came in. 225 rushing yards on just 24 carries from 3 different backs. Here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Temple's home field advantage is rated at 2.7 points, which is actually above average. Most people don't realize that. Lincoln Financial Field can get loud, and Temple's desperately trying to build something after years of mediocrity. The weather's perfect. 78 degrees, 9-mile-per-hour winds from the south-southwest, no precipitation. So we're not dealing with any weird conditions that might level the playing field. But here's my real concern with this line. Oklahoma's defense looked good against Michigan, holding them to 288 total yards. But Michigan's offense isn't exactly setting the world on fire this year. Bryce Underwood went 9 for 24 in his first road start. That's more about freshman nerves than Oklahoma's defense being elite. The market's basically saying Temple can hang within 2 touchdowns at home, but the computer models are screaming that Oklahoma should be laying 3 touchdowns or more. When you see that kind of disagreement, you've got to ask, what does the market know that the computers don't? Maybe it's that emotional letdown factor. Maybe it's the travel. Maybe it's that Oklahoma's still figuring out their identity under Venables, and one big win doesn't erase the 6-7 season they just had. Temple's got nothing to lose here. They're 2-0 for the first time since 2019. They've got quarterback depth. Their running game looks legit with that 3-headed attack. And honestly, sometimes these massive mismatches in power rankings create the exact spots where upsets happen. The value might be staring us right in the face, but it's not where most people think it is. So here's what jumps out at me about this Oregon-Northwestern matchup on Saturday. This line opened at minus 28.5, and honestly, I think there might be some value on the Ducks here. Look, Northwestern just put up 42 points against Western Illinois after getting absolutely boat raced by Tulane in Week 1. Preston Stone bounced back with 3 touchdown passes, but let's be real, Western Illinois isn't exactly a measuring stick. Meanwhile, Oregon is coming off back-to-back demolition jobs where they've outscored opponents 128-16. That's not a typo. The thing that has me leaning Oregon is the situational spot. Yeah, they're traveling almost 1,800 miles and dealing with a 2-hour time change, but this Northwestern team just lost their leading rusher Cam Porter to what looked like a significant lower body injury. He was on crutches after the game, and for a team that was already struggling to move the ball consistently, losing a 6-year veteran who's been their bell cow, that's massive. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The power rankings suggest Oregon should be favored by 29, but the line is sitting at 28.5. That's only a half point of value, but in a game where everyone expects a blowout, sometimes the books get lazy with these big spreads. Oregon's offense is just different this year. 9 different players scored touchdowns last week. 9! Dante Moore is settling in nicely at quarterback, and their defense is creating short fields with pick sixes. When your defense is scoring touchdowns, you're not just winning games, you're covering big numbers. Northwestern's defense did show some life, breaking up 8 passes and grabbing an interception. But here's the reality check. They're about to face an Oregon offense that just hung 631 total yards on their last opponent. The Wildcats' improved coverage might help them avoid getting completely embarrassed, but I don't see it stopping this Oregon attack. The weather in Evanston looks perfect. 80 degrees, light winds, maybe a trace of moisture. No excuses there. And Northwestern's home field advantage is actually below average at just 2.1 points, so they're not getting the typical boost you'd expect. Look, I get the hesitation on laying nearly 30 points on the road, but sometimes the talent gap is just too wide. Oregon has championship aspirations and just joined the Big Ten. They want to make a statement. Northwestern is in year 1 of a rebuild, missing their best offensive player, and facing a team that's been absolutely ruthless through 2 weeks. The total is sitting around 63.5, and that feels about right given Oregon's explosiveness, but if Porter can't go for Northwestern, their ability to sustain drives and keep this Oregon offense off the field becomes really questionable. Bottom line, Oregon minus 28.5 might feel like a lot of points, but when you're getting half a point of value according to the power rankings, and the opponent just lost their most important offensive player, sometimes you just have to trust the talent disparity and take the points with the better team. So Auburn's sitting at 2-0 after absolutely dismantling Ball State 42-3, and now they're welcoming an 0-2 South Alabama team that's been in 2 heartbreakers to start the season. But here's the thing. This isn't your typical cupcake matchup that it might look like on paper. Let me walk you through what I'm seeing here, because there's actually some interesting angles brewing. Auburn just put up 495 total yards against Ball State, with Jackson Arnold looking completely comfortable in his first year after transferring from Oklahoma. The guy threw for 251 and 3 touchdowns, hitting 9 different receivers. That's the kind of distribution that tells you the offense is clicking. But Ball State gave up -3 rushing yards. -3? That's not exactly a measuring stick for what Auburn's going to face Saturday. Now, South Alabama, and this is where it gets interesting, they're 0-2, but they've been competitive as hell. They just took Tulane to the wire, scoring 31 points, and actually had a 2-point conversion attempt with under a minute left that could have tied the game. Bishop Davenport threw for 231 and 2 touchdowns, plus he ran one in himself. Kentrell Bullock went for 107 yards rushing. So we're not talking about some pushover offense here. The thing that jumps out to me is Auburn's defensive performance. 6 sacks against Ball State held them to 68 total yards. But again, it's Ball State. South Alabama just put up explosive plays against a Tulane defense. 65-yard touchdown bomb to Davin Voisin. That's the kind of play that can change the complexion of a game real quick, especially if Auburn gets a little complacent. Here's what's really fascinating from a betting perspective. Auburn's getting 94 votes in the AP poll, second most among unranked teams. They're right on the cusp of being ranked, and this is exactly the kind of game where a team can either make a statement or, well, stub their toe. Hugh Freeze knows his team needs to keep building momentum, but you've got to wonder if there's going to be any letdown factor after that dominant home opener. The matchup I'm really keying in on is South Alabama's ability to move the ball against Auburn's front seven. We saw Auburn absolutely smother Ball State's ground game, but the Jaguars just had a back go for over 100 yards. If South Alabama can establish some kind of rhythm early and keep this thing competitive, the dynamics change completely. Weather's going to be perfect. 86 degrees, 4-mile-per-hour winds, no rain. So we're looking at a pure football game with no external factors. Auburn's got a below-average home field advantage at just 2.4 points, which is actually interesting when you think about line construction. The power rankings have Auburn in that dominant tier, but here's my thing. South Alabama's been in 2 games they probably should have won. Sometimes teams like that, when they finally get that breakthrough moment, it comes against a team that's maybe looking ahead or not giving them the respect they deserve. I'm not saying South Alabama wins this game outright, but if you're looking for value, this Auburn team is still figuring out who they are. Jackson Arnold looked great against Ball State, sure, but that was Ball State. The real test is going to be, can they maintain that balanced attack against a team that's actually going to make some plays on offense and force Auburn to respond? The late-game execution for South Alabama has been questionable. They had their chances against both opponents and couldn't quite close the deal. But sometimes all it takes is one game where everything clicks at the right time. Auburn's got everything to lose here. South Alabama's got nothing but upside. Ball State is in serious trouble, and I'm not sure this New Hampshire game is going to fix what's broken. The Cardinals just put up 68 total yards against Auburn. That's not a typo. 68 yards total. They had negative rushing yards. Their quarterback got sacked 6 times. This is an offense that couldn't move the ball if you spotted them first and goal. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but they're facing an FCS opponent at home. Surely they bounce back. And look, the power rankings do suggest Ball State is the much stronger team here. They've got a solid 2.8 home field advantage, which is actually above average. New Hampshire's making that 775-mile trek to Muncie, and road trips like that can wear on FCS programs. But here's what concerns me. This isn't just a one-week thing for Ball State. They've gone 2 straight weeks without scoring a touchdown. 2 weeks. That's not bad luck or a tough schedule issue. That's systematic offensive failure. Coach Aramovich is taking accountability, talking about needing to get things fixed, which tells me they're considering real changes to scheme or personnel. The defense actually played decent football against Auburn, which makes this situation even weirder. Usually when you see a team get blown out, it's because both sides of the ball collapsed. But Uramovich specifically praised his defense for competing against a really good offensive team. The problem is, when your offense goes 3-and-out constantly, even a decent defense gets worn down. So what does this mean for Saturday? Well, without a betting line to work with, we're flying blind on the market's opinion. But I'd be very cautious about laying big numbers with Ball State, even against FCS competition. Yes, they should win. The talent gap is real. But can they cover what's likely to be a substantial spread when they can't even move the ball consistently? The weather's going to be pretty neutral, 72 degrees, light winds from the west around 8 miles per hour with gusts up to 13. That wind might affect some deep throws and long kicks, but it's not going to be a major factor. Here's my take. This feels like a classic get-right spot for Ball State, but I'm not convinced they're capable of getting right just because they're playing weaker competition. Sometimes offensive dysfunction runs deeper than just the quality of opponent. If Ball State comes out and struggles to move the ball again, even against New Hampshire, then we're looking at a program with some serious foundational issues. The smart money might be on taking New Hampshire with whatever points they're getting, or potentially looking at the under if the total seems inflated based on Ball State's recent offensive struggles. Because right now, this Cardinal offense looks like it couldn't score in a scrimmage. UConn heads to Delaware on Saturday as a 2.5-point road favorite, and honestly, this line feels too tight for what we're looking at here. The Huskies just dropped a heartbreaker to Syracuse in overtime, a game they absolutely should have closed out. But here's the thing. Sometimes those gut-punch losses tell you more about a team's ceiling than their floor. Let me walk you through what really happened in that Syracuse game. UConn's defense was absolutely suffocating for 3 quarters. 3 sacks, 7 tackles for loss, held Syracuse to 44 rushing yards total. That's dominant football. But then, and this is where it gets interesting for bettors, they completely fell apart in the final 6 minutes. Syracuse scored twice in the last 5:41 of regulation. Then UConn couldn't punch it in from the 4-yard line in overtime. Now, the narrative here is that UConn can't close games, right? That's what everyone's going to focus on. But I'm seeing something different. This defense showed it can completely neutralize an ACC offense for long stretches. Joe Fagnano threw for 259 yards with a balanced rushing attack behind him. When this team executes, they look like they belong in that next tier. Delaware, meanwhile, just got worked by Colorado 28-13. Sure, they covered as 24.5-point dogs, but that Colorado game exposed some real concerns. Their defense couldn't handle multiple quarterback looks. Colorado's third-string guy threw 2 touchdown passes and led 4 scoring drives. That's not great. Here's where this gets really interesting from a betting perspective. Delaware's coach Ryan Carty has a 9-2 record in non-conference games, with losses only to Penn State and now Colorado, so they show up for these spots. But, and this is crucial, they're making the jump from FCS to FBS this year. That transition is no joke, especially against a UConn team that just proved it can dominate defensively against legitimate competition. The power rankings suggest UConn is solidly the stronger team, and we're getting them at basically a pick'em on the road. Delaware is getting standard home field advantage of about 2.5 points, which means the odds makers essentially view these teams as equals on a neutral field. That feels generous to Delaware. Weather's perfect in Newark, 71 degrees, light winds, no precipitation. So we're not dealing with any equalizers there. This comes down to execution and which team can impose their will. UConn's offensive balance is the key here. Cam Edwards and Mel Brown both went over 70 rushing yards against Syracuse, and Skylar Bell was a security blanket with 11 catches. If they can establish that ground game early, it takes pressure off Fagnano and sets up play-action opportunities. The concerning part? UConn's late-game execution. They had Syracuse dead to rights and let them back in. But here's my read. Sometimes those crushing losses can actually sharpen a team's focus. They know they let one slip away, and Delaware doesn't have the offensive firepower that Syracuse showed late. Delaware's defense just gave up 21 points to Colorado's backup quarterbacks. UConn's got more weapons and better execution than what Colorado rolled out there. I'm seeing a spot where the road favorite might actually be undervalued because everyone's focused on that Syracuse collapse rather than the 3 quarters of dominant football that preceded it. The number's sitting at 2.5, and I'm seeing about 2.8 of value on Delaware based on the power rankings. But sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole story. UConn's got the better team, better coaching, and they're hungry after that heartbreaking loss. Delaware's in their first year of FBS football, and transition years are tough. This feels like a spot where the market's overreacting to one bad finish and undervaluing the overall body of work. So, we're looking at Michigan State hosting Youngstown State this weekend. Honestly, this is one of those spots where the numbers tell a pretty clear story, but there's still some interesting angles to dig into. Let me start with what jumped out at me from Michigan State's last game. Aiden Chiles just had his coming out party against Boston College. 4 touchdown passes, 231 yards, and then he delivers the game-winning 2-point conversion in double overtime. But here's the thing that caught my attention. The kid got banged up late in regulation, looked hurt, but didn't miss a single snap in overtime. That's the kind of mental toughness you want to see from your quarterback, especially when you're laying big numbers. Now, before we get too carried away with the Chili's hype train, let's talk about what this matchup actually looks like on paper. We're dealing with what the power rankings are calling an extreme mismatch. Michigan State just went toe-to-toe with the Power 5 team in Boston College and came out on top in double overtime. Youngstown State? They're F circa S. That's a pretty significant talent gap, to put it mildly. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The narrative mentions that lines often get inflated in these spots because of public perception, and efficiency metrics become less reliable. Translation? The books know casual bettors are going to hammer the Power 5 team laying points against an FCS opponent, so they're probably going to push that number higher than it should be based on pure talent differential. What's working in Michigan State's favor beyond just the talent gap? Their special teams have been absolutely elite through 2 games. Ryan Eckley is averaging 54.7 yards per punt, and against Boston College, he dropped 2 punts on the 1-yard line in the fourth quarter. When you're facing an overmatched opponent, field position advantages like that can turn into easy scoring opportunities. The offense showed some real balance in that Boston College game too. Chiles wasn't just throwing the ball around. He added 39 rushing yards, and they were efficient in the red zone when it mattered. That versatility is huge when you're trying to cover a big spread, because you've got multiple ways to move the ball and put points on the board. Now, here's something that might give you pause if you're thinking about laying the points with Michigan State. Their home field advantage is only 2.1 points, which is actually below average. So while they're getting a boost from playing at home, it's not as significant as you might expect for a Big Ten team. The weather's going to be pretty much a non-factor. 78 degrees at kickoff, comfortable conditions. There's going to be some wind, maybe 10 to 16 miles per hour gusts from the west, which could make deep balls and long field goals a little trickier, but nothing that should dramatically impact the game flow. Here's my read on this whole situation. Michigan State is riding high after that emotional double overtime win. They've got a quarterback who just proved he can perform under pressure, and they're facing an opponent that frankly shouldn't be able to hang with them talent-wise. The question isn't whether Michigan State wins, it's whether they can put together 4 quarters of focused football against an overmatched opponent. The thing about these FCS versus Power 5 matchups is that sometimes the better team comes out flat, especially coming off an emotional high like that Boston College game. But this Michigan State team shows something in that double overtime win. They've got some grit, and Chiles looks like he's developing into a legitimate threat, both through the air and with his legs. If I'm handicapping this game, I'm looking at Michigan State's ability to start fast and put this thing away early. Their special teams advantage should give them short fields. Chiles has the confidence now to push the ball downfield, and Youngstown State is going to have a really hard time keeping up if the Spartans establish any kind of rhythm. So, Bill Belichick gets his first college win, 20-3 over Charlotte, and honestly, I'm not sure we learned much about what this North Carolina team actually is. The defense looked way better after getting torched for 48 by TCU in Week 1, but Charlotte's not exactly an offensive juggernaut, you know? Here's what's bugging me about the Tar Heels right now. They can script a good opening drive, score touchdowns on their first possession in both games so far, but then what? Gio Lopez throws for 155 yards on 17 of 25 attempts against Charlotte. That's not great against a team you should be dismantling. And the fact that Max Johnson, who played well in relief last week, couldn't even win the starting job, that tells me the quarterback situation is still a mess. Now, they're hosting Richmond this weekend, and this is where things get interesting from a betting perspective. Richmond's an FCS school, so we're talking about a massive talent gap on paper. But here's the thing. When you have these extreme mismatches, the betting lines often get inflated because of public perception. Everyone sees North Carolina versus Richmond and thinks, easy money, right? The problem is, efficiency metrics become way less reliable in these spots because you're not really comparing apples to apples. The power ranking suggests this should be a blowout, but I keep coming back to North Carolina's offensive issues. They struggled to put Charlotte away, and Charlotte's not good. Lopez is dealing with a back injury, needed help from trainers just to practice this week. If you can't consistently move the ball against CUSA competition, how do you cover what's probably going to be a massive spread against an FCS team? Now, Richmond's not a complete pushover in the FCS world, but let's be real, the talent difference should be overwhelming. North Carolina's defense showed real improvement, holding Charlotte to just 271 total yards and forcing 2 turnovers. That's the kind of performance you'd expect against lesser competition, and Richmond's offense is going to be even more limited. But here's where I'm getting hung up, and this might be the key to the whole game. North Carolina has this weird pattern where they can execute early but then just disappear for long stretches. Against Charlotte, they scored on that opening drive with a 51-yard touchdown to Chris Culliver, then basically went into cruise control. That's fine when you're playing a team you can physically dominate, but it raises questions about their killer instinct. The weather's going to be perfect, 78 degrees, calm winds, no precipitation, so we can throw out any environmental factors. North Carolina's home field advantage is actually below average at just 2.2 points, which is interesting. Most teams get around 3 to 4 points at home, so Chapel Hill doesn't provide as much of a boost as you typically expect. Here's my read on this game. North Carolina should win easily, but I'm not convinced they'll cover whatever massive spread the books hang on this thing. The offense is too inconsistent, the quarterback situation is unsettled, and they've shown a tendency to take their foot off the gas once they get ahead. Richmond's going to sell out to stop the run and force Lopez to beat them with his arm. If North Carolina can establish dominance early and keep pushing, which would be very Belichick-like, then yeah, this could get ugly fast. But if they revert to that pattern of scoring early then coasting, that's where value might exist on the underdog or the over, depending on how the total's set. The real question isn't whether North Carolina wins, it's whether they show the kind of complete four-quarter performance that builds confidence for ACC play. This Richmond game is basically a free look at where this team's head is at under Belichick, and honestly, I'm not sure they figured it out yet. So, we've got Northwestern State making the trek to Cincinnati this weekend, and honestly, this one's looking like it could get ugly fast. Let me paint you the picture here. Northwestern State just got absolutely obliterated by Minnesota, 66-0. And I'm talking complete obliteration. They managed 42 total yards. 42. That's not a typo. 2 first downs for the entire game. Their first 9 drives, 2 fumbles, 2 picks, and 5 3-and-outs. Minnesota put up 35 points in the first quarter alone, which was the most they'd scored in a quarter since 1973. Now Cincinnati's coming off a nice bounce-back win against Bowling Green, 34-20. Brandon Sorsby looked sharp, 333 yards passing, 3 touchdown throws, plus he ran for another score. The kid's showing that dual-threat ability that makes defenses uncomfortable. But here's what's interesting. Coach Satterfield said after the game there were a lot of questions about throwing the ball coming into that matchup. Well, those questions got answered pretty emphatically. The thing is, we're looking at a complete mismatch here in terms of competition level. Northwestern State just played their first Big Ten opponent in school history and got mercy ruled with 6 minutes left because of weather. They couldn't protect the quarterback, couldn't establish any run game, couldn't get stops on defense. It was a clinic on how not to play football at this level. Cincinnati, meanwhile, broke a historical losing streak against Bowling Green. They were 0-4 all-time against the Falcons before that game. So there's some confidence building there, and Sorsby's showing he can beat you multiple ways, whether it's the short passing game, deep shots to guys like Cyrus Allen who hauled in a 44-yard touchdown, or scrambling for crucial scores like that 27-yard rushing touchdown late in the third quarter. The concerning part for Northwestern State, their offensive line got dominated by Minnesota's front 7, complete breakdown in pass protection and run blocking. And now they've got to turn around and face a Cincinnati defense that, yes, has some concerns. Dante Corleone, their All-American nose tackle, had to leave the Bowling Green game twice with an ankle issue. But even if he's not 100%, Northwestern State showed they can't handle Big Ten-level athleticism, and Cincinnati's got plenty of that in the American Athletic Conference. Looking at this from a betting perspective, you've got to be careful with these extreme mismatches. The public's going to see that 66-0 beatdown and assume Cincinnati should roll by 40 or 50 points. But Northwestern State was playing Minnesota team that's legitimately good, not just capable. The step down from Big Ten to AAC is real, but it's still a massive upgrade for the Demons in terms of what they can handle. The weather's going to be perfect, 82 degrees at kickoff, minimal wind, no precipitation. So we're not getting any help from Mother Nature to keep this game close or create weird bounces that might favor the underdog. Cincinnati's shown they can put up points in bunches when things click, and Northwestern State's defense gave up over 400 yards to Minnesota while creating zero pressure. The Bearcats should be able to move the ball pretty much at will, especially if Sorsby continues this balanced attack where he's effective both through the air and on the ground. The real question becomes whether Northwestern State can score enough to make this interesting, or if we're looking at another blowout. Their offense was so bad against Minnesota that it's hard to see them moving the ball consistently against any decent defense, and Cincinnati showed some defensive capability, even without Corleone at full strength. So UTSA sitting at 0-2 after dropping back-to-back games, including that brutal I-35 rivalry loss to Texas State, where they gave up 951 total yards. 951! That's video game numbers, and not in a good way. Here's what's really concerning about this. Roadrunners start. It's not just that they're losing, it's how they're losing. Owen McCown threw for 219 yards and 2 touchdowns against Texas State, but he's completing just 53% of his passes. In college football, you can get away with a lot of things, but when your quarterback is missing nearly half his throws, you're playing with fire. The defense? Well, let's just say they're making every opposing offense look like the greatest show on turf. They're giving up explosive plays left and right, 65-yard touchdown passes, 75-yard rushing scores. That's not scheme problems, that's execution problems, and those are way harder to fix mid-season. Now, Incarnate Word comes in off a bye week, which is interesting timing. You've got an FCS program that's had 2 weeks to prepare for a struggling FBS team. The power rankings suggest this should be a blowout for UTSA, but here's the thing about these guarantee games. They're tricky. The betting markets aren't even touching this one, which tells you everything you need to know about how unpredictable these mismatches can be. When books won't hang a number, it's usually because there's too much variance to price properly. What really jumps out is UTSA's fourth-quarter execution. They went scoreless in the final 15 minutes against Texas State and couldn't move the ball on their last drive when they needed it most. 3 and out on incompletions when you're trailing? That's not talent, that's composure, and right now this team doesn't have it. The weather could actually play a factor here. We're looking at 15-mile-per-hour winds throughout the day, gusting up to 16 from the southeast during game time. In a game where UTSA needs to establish some rhythm and confidence, those winds could make McCown's accuracy issues even worse. Here's my read on this spot. UTSA desperately needs a get-right game, and on paper, this is exactly what you'd order up. But desperate teams don't always perform the way you expect them to. Sometimes they come out firing, sometimes they press and make more mistakes. Incarnate Words had 2 weeks to game plan. They know UTSA's struggling, and they've got absolutely nothing to lose. That's a dangerous combination. The Roadrunners might win this game by 21, or they might sleepwalk through another disappointing performance. With no betting line available, the real question becomes whether this is UTSA's bounce-back spot or if their problems run deeper than just a tough schedule. Given what we've seen so far, I'm not sure even the Roadrunners know the answer to that one. So Toledo just absolutely demolished Western Kentucky 45-14, and honestly, this wasn't even as close as the final score suggests. The Rockets put up 307 rushing yards, that's not a typo, led by Chip Trianum, who had a career day with 163 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now here's what caught my attention. Trianum hadn't rushed for over 100 yards since 2020. We're talking about a guy who transferred in from Kentucky, probably written off by a lot of people, and then he goes out and rips off a 75-yard touchdown run on the very first snap of the second half. That's the kind of momentum-shifting play that tells you everything about where Toledo's head is at right now. But let's dig deeper into what this really means, because the rushing attack is just one piece of the puzzle. Emmanuel McNeil-Warren picked off a pass and took it 37 yards to the house just 3 minutes into the game. Think about that for a second. You're Western Kentucky. You come out trying to establish some early rhythm, and boom, you're down 14-0 before you even know what hit you. The defense creating short fields, the offense capitalizing immediately. This is what championship-level execution looks like. And then when you add Junior Vandross III, hauling in 5 catches for 122 yards, including a 71-yard bomb, Toledo's showing they can beat you multiple ways. What really stands out to me is the transfer portal success story here. Trayanum from Kentucky having his career day, Kenji Christian from North Carolina A&T adding 91 rushing yards. This coaching staff clearly knows how to identify talent and put players in positions to succeed. That's not luck. That's systematic roster building. The power rankings have Toledo in blowout territory against most opponents, and with their 2.6 home field advantage, which is actually above average, they're getting even more of a boost than usual. When you're already the superior team talent-wise, and then you add that kind of home field edge, that's when you start seeing these 30-plus point blowouts. From a betting perspective, what jumps out is how Toledo controlled every phase after that early 14-7 lead. They outscored Western Kentucky 31-0 through most of the game. That's not just winning, that's making a statement. When a team shows that kind of killer instinct, that ability to step on an opponent's throat and not let up, you start paying attention to their future spreads. The weather looks perfect for this upcoming game too. 72 degrees, light winds from the south-southwest at maybe 4 miles per hour, essentially dry conditions. No excuses, no external factors to muddy the waters, just pure football. And Toledo's clearly built for that kind of environment. Here's my takeaway. This Toledo team isn't just winning games, they're developing an identity. The ground game breakthrough with Trayanum, the defensive playmaking, the big play capability through the air. All these pieces are clicking at the same time. And when you see transfer guys like Trayanum and Christian making immediate impacts, that tells you the culture and coaching are legit. For bettors, you want to be paying attention to how teams perform after big emotional wins like this. Can Toledo maintain this level, or do they come out flat? Based on what I'm seeing, the systematic way they broke down Western Kentucky, the multiple phases contributing, the coaching staff's ability to make halftime adjustments, this feels sustainable. The 45 points they put up weren't garbage time inflation either. This was methodical, efficient scoring from a team that knows exactly what it wants to do on both sides of the ball. So we've got SMU rolling into Springfield, Missouri, laying 28.5 points against Missouri State in what looks like a complete mismatch on paper. But hold on, because this line is screaming value, and not in the way you might think. Let me paint you the picture here. SMU just came off their 3rd straight loss to FBS competition, Clemson, Penn State, and now Baylor. In that Baylor game? That was brutal. They're up 38-24 with 8 minutes left, completely in control, and they somehow find a way to lose in double overtime. Kevin Jennings threw for 296 yards and 3 touchdowns. TJ Harden ran for 115 and 3 scores. This offense is still explosive as hell. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting for us. SMU has developed this really concerning pattern of late-game collapses. Against Baylor, their defense gave up 440 yards passing to Sawyer Robertson, including 2 touchdown passes in the final 5 minutes that completely erased a 14-point lead. Their kicker missed 2 field goals, including a 38-yarder in the second overtime that would have won it. Now Missouri State? They just got their first FBS win ever, beating Marshall 21-20. Jacob Clark threw for 359 and 3 touchdowns, including a clutch game-winning drive with 2 minutes left. Here's a team that's showing they can execute when it matters most, the exact opposite of what we're seeing from SMU right now. The power rankings say this should be a blowout, and yeah, on talent alone, SMU should dominate. But here's where the betting gets interesting. This line opened high because everyone's looking at SMU's college football playoff run last season and Missouri State's first year in FBS. The public's going to hammer SMU laying less than 30 against what they see as a cupcake. But I'm seeing something different. SMU's confidence is shot right now. 3 straight losses, all games they should have won, or at least covered. Meanwhile, Missouri State just proved they belong at this level. They can move the ball through the air, and most importantly, They know how to finish games. 28.5 is a massive number, especially when you factor in that SMU has been struggling to put teams away even when they're dominating. The weather's perfect, 88 degrees, light winds, no precipitation, so we're not getting any help from the elements to slow down either offense. I'm looking at this Missouri State team that just went on the road, ended Marshall's 9-game home win streak, and showed they can execute a game-winning drive under pressure. Meanwhile, SMU is coming off a game where they blew a 14-point lead in the final 8 minutes. The narrative here isn't about talent, it's about mentality. Missouri State is playing with house money, full of confidence from their historic first win. SMU? They're dealing with the pressure of being heavy favorites while trying to figure out why they keep choking away leads. Here's my take. This line is inflated by about 4 to 5 points based on perception rather than current reality. Missouri State plus 28.5? That's where the value is. SMU might win this game, but covering nearly 30 points when they've been mentally fragile in crunch time? That's a tough ask against a team that just proved they belong. Washington State travels 1,400 miles to Denton, Texas tonight, and the market's got this completely wrong. We're looking at a Cougars team that just put up 36 points and rushed for 139 yards after managing only 3 rushing yards the week before. That's not a typo. 3 yards to 139. Meanwhile, the betting public's buying into North Texas because they won in overtime at home, but let me tell you what really happened there. The Mean Green never led until overtime against Western Michigan. Never. They had to score twice in the fourth quarter, just to force extra time, then needed opponent penalties to bail them out for the win. That's not clutch. That's lucky. Sure, Mackenzie McGill ran for 102 yards, but when you dig into Washington State's defensive performance, they created a safety and generated consistent pressure. The Cougars' defense is flying under the radar here. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Power rankings have these teams essentially dead even, with Washington State holding just the slightest edge. But the betting market? They're laying points to North Texas because of home field advantage. The books are crediting the Mean Green with 2.8 points for being at home, which, that's actually higher than the typical home field boost in college football. But here's the thing, and this is where the value sits. The market's overreacting to that overtime win and undervaluing what we saw from Washington State's balanced attack. Jackson Potter completed 28 of 42 passes for 257 yards with 3 touchdowns and 0 picks. 0 interceptions, folks. That's the kind of ball security that wins road games. The travel narrative's getting overplayed, too. Yeah, it's a long trip and a 2-hour time difference, but this isn't a noon kickoff where circadian rhythms matter. The Cougars have had all week to prepare for this. What really stands out is Washington State's offensive evolution under Jimmy Rogers. He's the first Cougar coach since 2003 to win his debut opener, and more importantly, they scored 29 unanswered points after falling behind 7-0. That's not just talent, that's coaching and halftime adjustments. The weather's a non-factor tonight. 91 degrees at kickoff, low humidity, and while there's a 5-mile-per-hour wind from the south-southeast, that's not enough to impact passing games or field goals significantly. So here's my read. Washington State's getting 4.3 points of value based on the power ranking differential. They've shown they can run the ball now, Potter's protecting the football, and their defense can create momentum-shifting plays. North Texas needed overtime and penalties to beat Western Michigan at home. The market's giving you free money on a road team that's actually playing better football than their opponent. So here we are looking at Oregon State traveling to Lubbock, and honestly, the market is telling us a fascinating story here. Texas Tech opened as 7-point favorites, but there's this massive disconnect between what the power rankings say and where the betting line sits. We're talking about 6.5 points of value on Oregon State according to the advanced metrics. That's huge. Now, I get why the market loves Texas Tech right now. They've scored on their first 14 possessions of the season. 14 straight. That's absolutely ridiculous efficiency. Baron Morton looked sharp in that first half against Kent State. 18 of 26 for 258 yards and 3 touchdowns. But here's the thing. He's dealing with that hyperextended knee from week 1. Guys showed toughness playing through it, but Oregon State's going to test that mobility in ways Kent State never could. And speaking of Oregon State, everyone's looking at that 0-2 record and thinking, fade the Beavers, but hold on. Marlon Murphy threw for 371 yards and 4 touchdowns last week. Anthony Hankerson rushed for 136. They put up 528 total yards. The offense is absolutely humming. They're just finding creative ways to lose games. Those 4 failed 2-point conversions? That's not sustainable bad luck. That's execution. But here's what's interesting. They spread the ball around to 11 different receivers. Taz Reddick's caught 11 passes for 158 yards, and when you have that kind of depth, you can stress any secondary. The situational stuff is worth noting too. Oregon State's making that 1,300-mile trip, dealing with the 2-hour time change, and Lubbock sits at 3,200 feet elevation. Not Denver, but enough to matter. Plus, we've got 15-mile-per-hour winds with gusts up to 20. That's going to impact the passing games for both teams. Here's my read. Texas Tech has demolished 2 teams they should have demolished. Arkansas Pine Bluff and Kent State aren't telling us much about how they'll handle a Pac-12 offense that can actually move the ball. Oregon State's problem isn't generating offense. It's finishing drives and protecting leads. But in a game where they're getting 7 points, that's a lot of cushion for a team that's been competitive in both their losses. The transfer portal additions for Texas Tech look good on paper. Skylar Gill-Howard's 55-yard pick-6 was impressive, but Oregon State's diverse passing attack is going to test this defense in ways we haven't seen yet. And with Murphy's experience in that receiving corps depth, I'm thinking this total might have some upside too. The power rankings are screaming Oregon State +7. Sometimes the market overreacts to records and box scores, and sometimes the computers see something the public doesn't. With this much value showing up on the underdog and an Oregon State offense that can clearly move the ball, this feels like one of those spots where the market might be a step behind the data. So here's the deal with USC at Purdue. This line opened around 14.5, and honestly, that feels light for what we're looking at here. USC just hung 755 yards on Georgia Southern last week. 755. Jaden Mayava threw for 412 yards, which is the 14th most in USC history. And get this, 4 of his touchdown passes went for over 50 yards. That's not just good execution, that's Lincoln Riley's offense hitting on all cylinders. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Purdue's sitting at 2-0, and their coach Barry Odom just became the first Purdue coach to start 2-0 since 1916. Think about that for a second. They've already doubled last year's win total, and we're only 2 games in. Now, I'm not saying Purdue's suddenly elite, but there's something brewing in West Lafayette. Devin Maccabee just rushed for 126 and 2 touchdowns against Southern Illinois, and that ground game could be exactly what you need when you're trying to keep USC's explosive offense off the field. The power rankings tell us this should be a blowout. USC is operating in a different stratosphere than Purdue right now. But here's the thing that's nagging at me. USC's traveling 1,775 miles dealing with a 3-hour time zone shift, and their defense? Well, let's just say Georgia Southern moved the ball pretty consistently despite getting blown out. 377 yards allowed to an FCS team. That's not exactly inspiring confidence when you're laying 2 touchdowns on the road. And speaking of Purdue's opponent last week, they actually trailed Southern Illinois 14-7 in the first quarter. That's only the second time in school history they've trailed an FCS team. So we've got 2 teams that show some vulnerability against inferior competition, but USC's offensive firepower is just on another level. Wayman Jordan's breakout performance. 167 rushing yards, which is more than any tailback in Riley's 4 years at USC, that gives them the balanced attack they've been missing. When you can run it with Jordan and then hit those deep shots with Makai Lemon, who had 158 receiving yards in just the first quarter last week, that's a nightmare for any defense. The weather's not going to be a factor. 74 degrees at kickoff, light winds from the southwest, perfect conditions for USC to air it out. But here's my read on the value. The power rankings suggest this should be closer to 18 or 19 points, not 14.5. Purdue's home field advantage is below average at just 2.1, so that's not saving them much. I'm seeing about 1.9 of value on the Boilermakers based on the metrics, but I'm not sure I trust it. USC's offensive explosion last week looks sustainable. That wasn't just one hot quarter. They were consistently hitting explosive plays throughout the game. The total's sitting around 57, 57.5 depending on where you shop, and that feels like the sharper play to me. USC's averaging 66 points per game so far, and even if Purdue's improved defense shows up, I don't see them slowing down this Trojan offense enough to stay under. Here's the thing about this Georgia-Tennessee matchup that's got my attention. We're looking at two teams coming off completely different weekends, and the market might not be properly pricing in what we just saw. Georgia just had one of those games that keeps coaches up at night. Yeah, they beat Austin Peay 36-6, but if you watch that game, they had first and goal at the 1-yard line and couldn't punch it in. Back-to-back completions for negative yardage. Nate Frazier and London Humphreys both coughed up fumbles. This is supposed to be the number 4 team in the country, and they're making the kind of mistakes that'll get you buried in SEC play. Now, Tennessee's coming off a completely different vibe. They dropped 63 on East Tennessee State, with Joey Aguilar throwing for 288 and 2 touchdowns in just the first half. 427 yards before halftime. That's not just beating up on a weaker opponent. That's executing at a championship level. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings still have Georgia as the solidly stronger team, which makes sense based on their talent and recent history. However, Tennessee's getting 3.1 points of home field advantage at Neyland Stadium, and that's exceptional. Most home fields are worth about 2.5 to 3 points, so we're talking about a legitimately intimidating environment. When you run the numbers, Tennessee's actually showing moderate value at plus 1.2 versus the spread. That might not sound like much, but in college football, any value over a full point is worth paying attention to. The concerning part for Georgia isn't just the offensive hiccups, it's the ball security issues. In the SEC, you can't be putting the ball on the ground like Frazier and Humphreys did. Tennessee's defense has been inconsistent, sure, but they gave up 274 passing yards to Syracuse last week, which tells me they're still figuring things out on that side of the ball. Here's what I keep coming back to, though. Georgia's running game actually looked pretty solid. Chauncey Bowens had 56 yards and 2 touchdowns on 11 carries. Really physical runner. Frazier added 69 yards despite the fumble. 190 total rushing yards suggests they can lean on that ground game when the passing attack gets out of sync. But Tennessee's at home, they're feeling good about themselves after that offensive explosion, and Georgia's coming in with some real question marks about their offensive consistency. Add in that exceptional home field advantage, and you've got a recipe for what could be a really competitive game. The weather's going to be perfect. 76 degrees at kickoff, calm winds, no precipitation. So we're not dealing with any external factors that might favor one style of play over another. I think the market's still giving Georgia too much credit for their ranking and not enough respect to Tennessee's home environment and recent offensive efficiency. When you've got a team like Tennessee that can put up 63 points and they're getting points at home against a Georgia team that struggled to execute in the red zone, that's the kind of spot where upsets happen in college football. All right, so we're diving into the backyard brawl, and honestly, this line's got me scratching my head a bit. West Virginia getting 2.5 at home against Pittsburgh. That feels light, doesn't it? Let me walk you through what I'm seeing here. Pittsburgh just put up a clinic against Central Michigan, right? Eli Holstein looked fantastic. 304 yards, 4 touchdowns, even showed some wheels with that 31-yard scramble. The kid's clearly healthy after last year's injury concerns. But here's the thing that's bugging me. Central Michigan held the ball for almost 36 minutes in that game. 36 minutes! That's not a dominant defensive performance. That's a team that couldn't get off the field when they needed to. And then there's Holstein's turnover issue. 2 picks in 2 games now. That's not just bad luck, that's a pattern. Against a rivalry opponent in Morgantown, those mistakes get magnified real quick. Now flip over to West Virginia and, they fumbled 5 times against Robert Morris. 5! Lost 4 of them. That should terrify you as a bettor. Except, and here's where it gets interesting. They still put up 625 yards of total offense. That's not a typo. 625 against an FCS team. Sure. But Rodriguez's system is clearly starting to click. Nico Marcio looked comfortable running that no-huddle attack. 17 of 20 for 224 yards. Plus, he punched one in on the ground. Jaheim White's emerging as that feature back they needed, 93 yards and 2 scores. The offensive framework is there. But here's what's really catching my attention. The narrative around this game doesn't match the number. Everyone's talking about West Virginia's fumbles, Pittsburgh's offensive explosion, all the surface-level stuff. Meanwhile, the power rankings show these teams are basically dead even, maybe Pittsburgh with a tiny edge. West Virginia's getting 2.5 at home, with a strong home field advantage that typically adds about 2.5 points. So we're essentially looking at a pick game where one team's getting spotted nearly a field goal. That feels generous. Look, I get why the market's skeptical of West Virginia. New coach, new system, those fumbles looked ugly on TV. But Rodriguez has been in this spot before, and that offensive system, when it's humming, can put points on the board in a hurry. Pittsburgh's defense just allows Central Michigan to control the clock for 2/3 of the game. What happens when they're facing a team that wants to snap the ball every 15 seconds? The weather's perfect, 71 degrees, calm winds, no precipitation. Both offenses should be able to execute their game plans. And in a rivalry game like this, the team getting points at home with all that emotional juice. I'm not saying West Virginia is definitely the play, but that 2.5 feels like the market overreacting to one sloppy performance while ignoring some real underlying strengths. This line should probably be closer to a pick, maybe Pittsburgh laying one. Instead, we're getting nearly 3 with the home dog in a heated rivalry. So we've got Rutgers hosting Miami, Ohio on Saturday, and honestly, this feels like one of those spots where the obvious play might actually be the right play for once. Let me walk you through why this matchup has my attention. Coming off their opener against Ohio University, not the Redhawks we're seeing this week, but the Bobcats. Rutgers looked, well, pretty damn impressive actually. Ethan Kaliakman has threw for 252 yards and 2 touchdowns, but here's what caught my eye. They went 5 for 5 on 4th down. 5 for 5. That's not luck. That's a team that believes in itself and has the execution to back it up. The transfer portal additions are already paying dividends too. DT Sheffield pulled in 4 catches for 85 yards and a touchdown in his debut, while CJ Campbell Jr. added 70 rushing yards. When you're integrating 19 transfers, that's a program high under Schiano, and they're contributing immediately? That tells you something about the culture and preparation in Piscataway. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings suggest this should be an absolute bloodbath. We're talking extreme mismatch territory. And usually when you see that kind of gap, the public hammers the favorite and inflates the line beyond where it should be. Now, I don't have the actual spread to work with here, but I'm guessing it's going to be substantial. And normally, I'd be looking for spots to fade the heavy chalk in these cupcake games. But this Rutgers team, they're not your typical early season favorite getting fat off a weak opponent. Let's talk special teams for a second, because this is where Rutgers becomes genuinely dangerous. They blocked another punt for a touchdown against Ohio. That's their 44th blocked punt under Schiano, with 16 going for touchdowns. Since 2022, they lead the entire country with 11 blocked punts. This isn't a fluke stat. This is systematic dominance. Miami, Ohio is walking into a buzzsaw here, and special teams might be where this game gets completely out of hand. When you're already facing a talent deficit and then you've got to worry about getting punts blocked for touchdowns. Good luck with that game plan. The weather's going to be perfect. 69 degrees at kickoff, light winds, maybe a trace of moisture, but essentially dry conditions. No excuses there for either team. Here's my one concern with Rutgers. 3rd down defense. They let Ohio convert 5 of 10 attempts and allowed Navarro to keep that game closer than it should have been in the second half. Against Miami, Ohio, that might not matter much given the talent gap, but it's worth noting for future spots. The home field advantage is actually below average at just 2.1 points, which is interesting. But when you're already this much better than your opponent, you don't need much help from the crowd. Look, I know laying big numbers in early season games makes people nervous, and rightfully so. But sometimes the obvious play is obvious for good reasons. Rutgers has the talent, the coaching, the special teams edge, and they're coming off a confidence-building performance where everything clicked. Miami, Ohio, they're walking into a program that's won 14 of their last 16 season openers. That's not coincidence. That's preparation and culture. And with 19 new faces already contributing, this feels like a Rutgers team that could surprise some people this season. The line's probably going to be ugly, but sometimes you just have to trust what your eyes are telling you. This has all the makings of a comfortable Rutgers cover, assuming the number doesn't get completely out of hand. So here we are, folks. Penn State hosting Florida International, and I'll be honest, this isn't exactly the marquee matchup we're all dying to break down. But here's the thing. Sometimes these massive mismatches tell us more about a team than the close games do. especially when you're trying to figure out if Penn State is actually ready for what's coming. Let me paint the picture for you. We're looking at what the power rankings call an extreme mismatch, and they're not wrong. But the real story isn't whether Penn State wins, it's how they win, and whether they can finally fix the glaring issue that's going to bite them when conference play starts. Red zone efficiency. That's the elephant in the room with this Penn State team. Against FIU last time out, they struggled to finish drives in the first half, settling for field goals when they should have been punching it in for touchdowns. Sound familiar? It should, because they did the exact same thing against Nevada in Week 1 for field goals instead of touchdowns. James Franklin himself said they made it harder than we needed it to be, and that's coach speak for we left points on the board. Now here's where this gets interesting from a betting perspective. Everyone's going to look at this Penn State defense, and rightfully so. They just pitched a shutout against FIU, with Tony Rojas making 10 tackles, and the secondary picking off passes. Dominant performance, no question. But defenses can mask offensive inefficiencies in these blowouts. And that's exactly what happened. The running game, though, that's where Penn State showed some real juice. Katron Allen went for 144 yards on 16 carries, including a 67-yard touchdown. When you combine him with Nicholas Singleton, you've got a backfield that can break games open, but only if they can finish those drives in the red zone. And here's a wrinkle that caught my attention. Devontae Ross came back from injury way ahead of schedule. Wasn't supposed to be back until Week 4, but there he was, hauling in a 42-yard touchdown. That's depth they desperately needed, and it gives Drew Aller another reliable target. But Franklin made a comment that really stood out to me. He said they're playing a lot of young guys, and it felt like that at times. That showed up in that sluggish first-half performance, and here's why that matters for bettors. These young players are still adjusting to game speed, still making mistakes that more experienced teams will absolutely punish. So what's the value here? Well, if this line comes out and it's massive, which it should be, the question isn't whether Penn State covers. It's whether they can put together complete games, because the red zone issues and the youth factor, those don't just disappear because you're playing an overmatched opponent. The weather's going to be perfect. 70 degrees, light winds from the east-southeast at about 3 miles per hour. No excuses there. Home field advantage is solid at 2.6 points, which actually compounds Penn State's power ranking edge. Look, Penn State's going to win this game, but the way they win it. Do they finally clean up those red zone issues? Or do they settle for field goals again? That's going to tell us everything we need to know about whether this team can handle what's coming when the real games start. So here's what I'm seeing with this Iowa State at Arkansas State matchup, and honestly, the market might be missing something pretty significant here. Iowa State comes in at 3-0 after that wild finish against Iowa, with Kyle Conradi drilling another 54-yarder to win it. But here's the thing that's got my attention. Arkansas State just got absolutely demolished by Arkansas, giving up 420 yards to one player. Their quarterback, Taylor Green. That's not a typo. One guy put a 420 on him. Now, normally when you see a blowout like that 48-14 beatdown, you'd think the losing team is cooked, right? But let me tell you what's making me think twice about this spread. First off, Arkansas State lost their best player before that Arkansas game even started. Jaquez Cross, their preseason all-conference running back, went down with a season-ending knee injury, so they were playing without their primary offensive weapon against an SEC team that's frankly just better than Iowa State. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings have Iowa State in what they call the dominant team tier, meaning if both teams show up motivated, the underdog is usually just trying to cover the spread. A loss would be a genuine shock for the Cyclones. That sounds scary if you're thinking about Arkansas State, right? Wrong, because the market has given Iowa State nearly 10 points on the road, and my power ranking suggests there's about 3.5 points of disagreement here. That's significant edge territory, folks. Look, Iowa State's had success in these tight games. Their last 6 wins in the Cyhawk series were decided by a combined 15 points. They know how to grind out victories. Rocco Becht managed that 6.5-minute drive to set up the winning kick, showing they can control the clock when needed. But here's my concern with laying this many points. Arkansas State's defense got torched, sure, but it was against a dual-threat quarterback who went for 420 yards. Iowa State doesn't have that kind of explosive offensive ceiling. Beck's more of a game manager than a game breaker. And here's something that caught my eye in the data. Arkansas State's Chauncey Cobb returned a kickoff 98 yards for a touchdown, even in that blowout loss. That tells me their special teams unit has serious explosiveness, and those kinds of plays can flip games quickly, especially when you're getting double digits. The weather's going to be perfect, 86 degrees, calm winds, no precipitation. So we're not dealing with any external factors that might favor the more physical team or impact the passing game. You know what? I keep coming back to that 3.5 points of value the power rankings suggest. When you're getting nearly 10 points with a home team that has explosive special teams capability against a road favorite that doesn't have a high offensive ceiling, that's tough to ignore. Iowa State should win this game, but laying 9.5 points on the road against a team with nothing to lose, that's a different conversation entirely. So here's the thing about Missouri, Louisiana. The market is telling us one story, but the power rankings are screaming something completely different. And that's where things get interesting. Missouri's coming off this incredible comeback against Boston College, where they were down 21-6 and just refused to fold. Bo Pribula threw for 334 yards. Kevin Coleman Jr. had 10 catches for 126, and then, boom, Jamal Roberts breaks off a 63-yard touchdown run to seal it. That's the kind of balanced offense that can put teams away. But here's where it gets weird. The power rankings have Missouri in this dominant team tier, right? Like, if both teams show up motivated, Louisiana's basically just trying to cover the spread. A loss would be legitimately shocking for Missouri. Yet the market's only laying, around 3 points? That creates a 6.9 discrepancy between what the power rankings suggest and what Vegas is telling us. Now, Louisiana, man, they're dealing with some real issues. Only 239 total yards against Rice. Walker Howard threw for 88 yards and a pick, and they couldn't score in the first half. 6 points through 3 quarters. That's rough. And the red zone stuff? They had 4th and 2 with 6:30 left, couldn't convert, game over. But here's what's nagging at me. Missouri's home field advantage is only 2.4. That's below average, so they're not getting the typical boost you'd expect. Louisiana's making this 600-mile trip, but honestly, in college football, that's not really a factor anymore. The weather's perfect, 82 degrees, light winds from the south-southeast, maybe a trace of moisture, but basically dry conditions. So we can throw out any weather angle. What I keep coming back to is this. Missouri has shown they can execute under pressure. Those 4th down conversions in the 4th quarter against Boston College, the way they responded to that early deficit, that's mental toughness. Louisiana, meanwhile, is struggling with the exact opposite. They had chances to tie or win late and could only manage a field goal until that garbage time touchdown. The defense for Louisiana actually kept them in it. They held Rice to just 251 yards. So they can play defense, but if your offense is only putting up 6 points in 3 quarters, what's the point? You know what this feels like to me? The market's being way too respectful of Louisiana's recent history, maybe their coaching, their program reputation. But the power rankings are looking at what's actually happening on the field right now, and that's a Missouri team that's finding ways to win games they probably shouldn't against a Louisiana team that can't execute when it matters. 6.9 points of value that's significant. That's the market basically saying these teams are close to even when the actual performance data suggests Missouri should be laying close to 10. I'm not saying bet the house on Missouri, but when you've got that kind of disagreement between sharp analytics and the betting market, combined with what we're seeing from Louisiana's offense, the value seems pretty clear here. So here's the thing about this Texas UTEP matchup that's got me scratching my head. We've got what looks like a complete mismatch on paper, but the betting market is telling a totally different story. The power rankings have this as basically a joke. They're saying Texas should be favored by over 30 points, but the actual betting line, we're looking at something way, way lower than that. I'm talking about a 6.7 gap between what the computers think and what Vegas is putting out there. That's massive. Now, normally when you see this kind of disconnect, it's because the public is hammering the underdog for sentimental reasons, right? But this feels different. UTEP just dropped 42 on an FCS team that was getting votes in the coaches poll. Their quarterback Malachi Nelson, and yeah, that's a name you should remember, threw for 278 yards and 4 touchdowns with 0 picks. The kid's got arm talent, and he showed it with completions of 48 and 74 yards. But here's where it gets interesting. Texas just had Arch Manning throw for 295 and 4 touchdowns against San Jose State, including an 83-yard bomb. That's their longest touchdown pass since 2017. So we've got two quarterbacks coming off explosive performances, but the talent gap is, well, it's enormous. The situational stuff is where this gets murky, though. UTEP's on a short week, traveling 530 miles to Austin after that emotional bounce-back win. They're dealing with the time zone change, and honestly, when you're UTEP playing at Texas, that's already a massive mountain to climb without adding travel fatigue. Texas's defense just forced 4 turnovers against San Jose State after getting completely shut out in the turnover department against Ohio State. That's a defense that's looking to make a statement. But, and this is important, they also gave up 12 penalties for 115 yards. Coach Sarkisian called it 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that lack of discipline, against a team like UTEP that needs every break they can get, those penalties could keep drives alive. The weather's going to be typical Texas heat, 92 degrees at kickoff with 14-mile-per-hour winds from the southeast. Not brutal, but those winds could affect the deep passing games that both teams just showed off. And with Manning acknowledging he was sloppy in the red zone last week throwing that pick down there, you have to wonder if the conditions might amplify those issues. Here's my thing, though. When power rankings in the betting market disagree this dramatically, somebody's wrong. Either the computers are overvaluing Texas's talent advantage, or the odds makers are giving UTEP way too much credit for beating up on an FCS team. The home field advantage at Texas is rated at 2.9, which is above average, and that crowd is going to be fired up to see what Arch Manning can do. But UTEP's got some real weapons. Kenny Odom caught 5 balls for 124 yards, and Ashton Emery accounted for 3 total touchdowns. These guys can move the ball. I keep coming back to that 6.7 discrepancy, though. That's not just noise. That's the market telling us something fundamental about how this game might play out. Maybe it's about motivation, maybe it's about Texas looking ahead, or maybe UTEP is just better than anyone wants to admit right now. All right, so we've got this fascinating situation brewing in Miami, where South Florida just pulled off one of the most impressive back-to-back upsets we've seen in years, and now they're walking into Hard Rock Stadium as massive underdogs against a Miami team that's, well, let's just say they haven't exactly been tested yet. Here's what's wild about this South Florida story. They didn't just beat one ranked team, they beat 2 in consecutive weeks. First, they knocked off Boise State. Then they went and stunned number 13 Florida, 18-16, with a game-winning field goal as time expired. That's the kind of momentum that can carry a program to places nobody saw coming. But here's where it gets really interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings are screaming that Miami should be laying double digits here. We're talking about a 7.5-point disagreement between what the computer models think this line should be and where it's sitting. That's a massive gap, especially in college football where the sharp money usually narrows those discrepancies pretty quickly. Now, Miami looked absolutely dominant against an FCS opponent last week, sure. Carson Beck was surgical, completing his first 15 passes to break a Miami record that stood since 1986. The guy hasn't thrown an interception in 185 consecutive attempts dating back to his Georgia days. That's the kind of ball security that wins big games. But, and this is a big but, Miami just lost their starting linebacker Wesley Bissath to a targeting penalty, which means he's sitting out the first half of this game. Against the South Florida team that just orchestrated an 87-yard game-winning drive when it mattered most, that's not ideal timing. The weather's going to be typical South Florida, 80 degrees, muggy as hell with that 69% humidity that just saps your energy. 8-mile-per-hour winds from the northeast, so nothing that's going to impact the passing game. But those conditions favor the team that's more battle-tested. And right now, that's clearly South Florida. Here's what I keep coming back to, though. South Florida isn't just riding some fluky momentum. They've shown they can execute under pressure. That game-winning drive against Florida wasn't lucky. It was clutch. Their kicker Nico Gramatica already proved he can handle the big moment, nailing that 20-yard winner as time expired after missing from 58 earlier in the game. That's mental toughness you can't teach. Miami's home field advantage is only worth 1.9, well below the national average. So we're essentially looking at a neutral site game, where the market is giving us 7.5 points on a team that just proved they belong on the same field with top 15 competition. The math here is pretty compelling. The over-under is sitting at 52.5, and with Miami's offensive efficiency and South Florida's ability to move the ball when they need to, that number feels, well, it feels about right, maybe even a touch low given the pace both teams have shown. Look, I'm not saying South Florida wins this game outright, but they're getting points in a spot where they've already proven they can hang with better competition. Miami's been dominant, sure, but against who? Sometimes the market overreacts to style points against inferior competition, and that 7.5 point gap between power rankings and the betting line suggests we might be seeing exactly that here. So here we are, Liberty of Bowling Green, and the more I dig into this matchup, the more I'm convinced we're looking at a perfect storm brewing for the Flames to get right after that ugly Jacksonville State loss. Let me paint you the picture here. Liberty just gave up 338 rushing yards to Jacksonville State. 338. That's the kind of number that makes defensive coordinators lose sleep. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting for us as bettors. Bowling Green just showed us exactly who they are offensively. And, it's not pretty. Eddie George had his boys punting on 4th and 3 from Cincinnati's 41-yard line. 4th and 3? You're telling me you don't trust your offense to get 3 yards when you're already down? That's the kind of conservative coaching that tells me George is still figuring out this whole FBS thing. And when they did get into the red zone, Drew Pine and company couldn't punch it in when it mattered. Now, Liberty's got their own issues, don't get me wrong. 2 turnovers that Jacksonville State turned into 14 points will kill you every time. But here's what I'm seeing. Ethan Vasco still threw for 335 yards on 19 of 29 passing. That's efficient. And they've got those explosive plays. 52-yard rushing TD, 62-yard passing TD. When Liberty's clicking, they can strike fast. The betting market's got Liberty favored by around 4.5, and honestly, I think that's light. The power rankings suggest Liberty should be laying closer to 7.5 points here. We're getting, almost 3 points of value on a team that, yeah, they struggled against Jacksonville State's ground game. But they're facing a Bowling Green offense that couldn't convert 4th and 2 at Cincinnati's 12-yard line. Look, Bowling Green's home field advantage is only worth about 2 points according to the data, which is below average. So we're not talking about some intimidating environment that's going to rattle a Liberty team that went on the road and beat power conference teams last season. The weather's going to be perfect. 73 degrees, maybe a little breeze, but nothing that changes how either team wants to attack. And here's the kicker. Eddie George's conservative approach in his first FBS loss, that screams to me like a coach who's not ready to let his team loose yet. Meanwhile, Liberty's got that defending Conference USA champion pedigree, and they know they can't afford to start 0-2 in league play. I mean, think about it. Liberty's explosive offense against a Bowling Green defense that just watched Cincinnati put up 34 points. And Liberty's suspect run defense? Well, Bowling Green just showed they can't establish any kind of ground game even when they needed to. The narrative writes itself here. Liberty bounces back at home. On the road. Liberty bounces back against a Bowling Green team that's still finding its identity under a first-year FBS coach. Drew Pine's got experience, sure, but experience losing to better competition doesn't necessarily translate to beating better competition. I'm taking Liberty minus the points, and I'm feeling good about it. Sometimes the obvious play is obvious for a reason. So Mississippi State just pulled off something they haven't done in over 30 years, beat a top 15 non-conference opponent. And honestly, this Arizona State win might tell us way more about where this program's headed than anyone realizes. Here's what jumped out at me from that game. Blake Shapen threw a 58-yard touchdown bomb with 30 seconds left to win it. But here's the thing. They got outgained 238-59 in the second half before that final drive. Arizona State scored 20 unanswered points and had Mississippi State on the ropes. Now, you could look at that and say, well, they folded under pressure, but I'm seeing it differently. This team found a way to win when everything was falling apart. That's not something you can coach easily. Either you have that clutch gene or you don't. The offensive numbers from that game are pretty eye-opening. Shapen threw for 279 yards and 3 touchdowns. Brennan Thompson, 6 catches, 133 yards, 2 scores. Anthony Evans had 108 yards on 9 catches. This isn't some one-dimensional ground-and-pound attack we're dealing with. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The defense actually showed up against Arizona State after getting absolutely torched by Cam Skatebo for nearly 300 rushing yards last year. They held Sam Leavitt to just 82 passing yards, forced 2 picks, and has 6 tackles for loss. Now, the power rankings are telling a pretty extreme story here. We're looking at what the data guys are calling a mismatch situation, and you know what happens in these spots. The betting public gets all confused by perception versus reality. Mississippi State's only getting 2.2 points of home field advantage, which is below average, so they're not getting that typical bump you'd expect. But when you're already favored by the metrics and you're at home, even a small edge compounds. The weather's going to be perfect. 77 degrees at kickoff, 7-mile-per-hour winds, no precipitation. Nothing to worry about there. Here's my read on this whole situation. Jeff Lebby's got his first signature win under his belt. The offense has shown it can make explosive plays when it matters. And that defense, they're not great, but they're not the liability they were last year. The concerning part is those second-half adjustments. Getting outgained by that margin after halftime suggests other teams are going to figure out how to attack this defense. But sometimes you've got to ask yourself, is that a systemic problem? Or was Arizona State just that good at making adjustments? I think we're looking at a Mississippi State team that's better than people realize, playing at home with momentum from their biggest win in decades. The metrics love them, the recent performance backs it up, and they've got weapons that can strike from anywhere on the field. The question isn't whether they can compete, they just proved that. The question is whether they can do it consistently, week after week, when teams have more tape on what Lebby's trying to build down in Starkville. So we've got Merrimack making the 941-mile trek down to Georgia to face Kennesaw State, and honestly, this matchup tells 2 very different stories about where these programs are right now. Let's start with what happened last week, because it's pretty telling. Kennesaw State got absolutely demolished by Indiana, 56-9. I mean, we're talking about a team that managed just 3 field goals against a Power 4 opponent. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting for bettors. That loss might actually tell us more about Indiana being really good than Kennesaw State being terrible. Because if you dig into it, QB Amari Odom actually completed 10 of 16 for 176 yards. That's not awful efficiency. The problem was they couldn't punch it in when it mattered. 3 field goals from Daniel Kinney, including a 50-yarder, so the kicking game's solid. But 0 touchdowns? That's concerning. Now flip over to Merrimack and you see a completely different story. These guys were up 17-14 on Kent State with under 6 minutes left. They had it. QB Aiden Pereira was doing everything, 176 passing, 103 rushing. The guy's a legitimate dual threat who can hurt you multiple ways. But here's where it gets ugly, and this is huge for handicapping this game. Merrimack kicks a field goal to take the lead, then immediately gives up a 100-yard kickoff return for a touchdown. Game over. That's not bad luck, that's a fundamental coverage breakdown when it matters most. And that tells us something really important about both teams. Kennesaw State might struggle to score touchdowns, but they've got big play ability. Meanwhile, Merrimack can move the ball and build leads, but their special teams coverage is a disaster waiting to happen. The situational factors here are fascinating too. Merrimack's making this massive road trip, but honestly, sometimes teams play looser on the road when there's no pressure. And Kennesaw State's coming off back-to-back losses to Power 4 opponents, Wake Forest by 1, then that Indiana blowout. You've got to wonder about the mindset. Are they pressing? Are they relieved to finally play someone at their level? Because let's be honest, this Merrimack team showed they can hang around and make games interesting. The other thing that jumps out is the red zone execution. Both teams struggled to finish drives last week, but for different reasons. Kennesaw State couldn't get there against superior talent. Merrimack got there but couldn't convert when the game was on the line, turning it over on downs at the Kent State 41 with under 2 minutes left. Weather's going to be perfect. 81 degrees, calm winds, no precipitation. So this comes down to execution, not conditions. If I'm looking at this game, I'm thinking about which team figures out how to finish drives first. Kennesaw State has the home field, but it's only worth about 2 points according to the data, which is below average. They're rated as the stronger team overall, but after getting boat raced by Indiana, are they going to be tight? Merrimack showed real fight against Kent State until that special teams meltdown. If they can keep kickoff coverage honest and Pereira continues making plays with his legs, this could be a lot closer than people expect. The kicking game could be huge here too. Both teams showed they can hit field goals, but in a potentially sloppy game between teams still figuring things out, those three-pointers might be the difference. So Charlotte's sitting at 0-2 after getting completely shut down by North Carolina last week, and honestly, the film tells a pretty ugly story. We're talking about a team that managed just 271 total yards and, well, here's the kicker. They averaged 0.7 yards per carry, 0.7. That's not a typo. 21 yards on 29 attempts tells you everything you need to know about their offensive line right now. When your run game is that broken, it exposes everything else. And sure enough, quarterback Connor Harrell was under pressure all day, completing 17 of 29 for just 140 yards. But here's where it gets really interesting from a betting perspective. Charlotte's defense actually kept them in the game longer than they had any right to be. North Carolina only put up 20 points against what should have been a complete mismatch. That defensive effort is, well, it's something to build on. The red zone execution, though, that's where this team's season might be getting defined. 4th and 6 in the end zone, third quarter, chance to make it a real game. And their receiver drops a catchable pass. Coach saw Harrell put both hands on his helmet afterward. And you can feel that frustration building. Now they're getting Monmouth at home, and the power rankings have Charlotte as the solidly stronger team. But here's the thing. This Charlotte squad doesn't have what Coach Tim Auburn calls a game breaker on offense. No explosive plays, no consistent drives, no real threat to break one. Monmouth's making a 503-mile trip, which, look, travel's travel, but that's not exactly a cross-country haul. And Charlotte's home field advantage? 1.7. That's well below the national average, so we're not talking about some fortress here. The weather's going to be perfect. 75 degrees, 4-mile-per-hour winds from the south-southeast, no precipitation. Ideal conditions for both teams to execute their game plans without any external factors. So here's my read. Charlotte should win this game on paper, but they've got to prove they can actually move the football consistently. If that run game doesn't show dramatic improvement, if Harrell can't find some rhythm, we might be looking at a team that struggles to cover even modest spreads at home. The defensive foundation is there, the conditions are perfect, but offensively, they need to show they're more than just a team hoping for opponent mistakes. So we've got Florida Atlantic heading down to Miami to face FIU, and there's something really interesting brewing here that the market might be missing. Let me start with what happened last week, because it tells us everything about where these teams actually are. FAU just demolished Florida A&M 56-14 after getting absolutely embarrassed by Maryland the week before. Now you might think, okay, they beat up on an FCS team, so what? But here's the thing. Caden Veldkamp threw 5 touchdown passes after throwing 4 picks against Maryland. That's not just a bounce back, that's a complete mental reset. And the way they did it, 39-0 at halftime. When a quarterback goes from 4 interceptions to 5 touchdowns in the span of a week, that's either fool's gold or real confidence restoration. I'm leaning toward the latter because of how balanced they looked. 309 passing yards, 193 rushing. That's the kind of offensive diversity that travels well. Now FIU, here's where it gets interesting. They got shut out by Penn State 28-0. But if you watch that game, and I mean really watched it, they held the number 2 team in the country to 10 points in the first half. Willie Simmons said afterward that they showed they can play with anyone in America when they do things right. The problem? They're still figuring out how to do things right for 4 quarters. But here's what's fascinating about this matchup. FIU has 25 transfers on their roster under a first-year coach. That's a team that's still learning each other's names, let alone each other's tendencies. Meanwhile, FAU just had their aha moment against Florida A&M. The power rankings are telling us something the betting market isn't hearing. There's a 2-point disagreement here, with the computer models favoring FAU more than the odds makers. When you see that kind of separation, you've got to ask yourself, what does Vegas know that the computers don't, or vice versa? I think it comes down to this. FIU's home field advantage is only worth about 2 points, which is below average. So you're essentially getting FAU as a pick, M on a neutral field, despite them looking significantly sharper last week and having better offensive balance. The weather down in Miami is going to be typical South Florida, 79 degrees, muggy, 72% humidity. Both teams are used to it, so that's a wash. But when you're talking about stamina in those conditions, the team that can run the ball effectively usually has an edge. FAU showed they can do exactly that with Kamari Sands running for 83 yards last week. Look, FIU's defensive effort against Penn State was admirable, but they couldn't sustain it. They had multiple drives stall in scoring position because of execution breakdowns. That's not something you fix in a week, especially with a roster full of guys still learning the system. The narrative here is pretty clear. FAU is coming off a confidence-building blowout, where their quarterback found his rhythm, while FIU is coming off a moral victory that still resulted in a shutout loss. In college football, momentum and confidence matter more than people want to admit, especially with young quarterbacks. I'm seeing value on Florida Atlantic here. The power rankings suggest they're the better team. The recent performance trends support that. And you're getting them at a number that might not fully account for FIU's growing pains with all those transfers. So here's what we've got brewing in Blacksburg. Virginia Tech is laying 14.5 points against Old Dominion, but the power rankings are screaming that this line is way off. We're talking about a massive 9.3 discrepancy between what the market thinks and what the analytics suggest. That's the kind of gap that makes you sit up and pay attention. Now let's dig into what just happened to both these teams, because it tells a pretty wild story. Virginia Tech just got absolutely boat raced by Vanderbilt in the second half, and I mean completely dismantled. They were outgained 307-21 in the final 30 minutes and gave up 34 unanswered points. That's not just losing. That's falling apart at the seams. But here's where it gets interesting. Old Dominion just dropped 54 points on North Carolina Central, and their quarterback Colton Joseph looked like he was playing a video game. 19 of 24 for 257 yards, 4 total touchdowns, 0 picks. The guy was surgical. And get this. Running back Traquan Jones had a 93-yard touchdown run. That's a program record, folks. So we've got Virginia Tech coming off a complete meltdown, facing an Old Dominion team that just discovered they can score in bunches. The Hokies are supposedly the dominant team here. Power rankings have them in that top tier, but they just showed they can't maintain focus for 4 quarters against a decent opponent. Now, Virginia Tech does have that home field advantage working for them. Lane Stadium is giving them about 2.6 points, which is above average. And let's be real, Old Dominion is still Old Dominion. They're not exactly known for traveling well against ACC competition. But here's what's bugging me about this line. The market has Virginia Tech laying 2 touchdowns like they're some unstoppable force, when they just proved they're anything but. Coach Brent Pry is sitting at 16-23 over 4 seasons. And those fans were dead silent in the second half against Vandy. That's not exactly the atmosphere of a confident program. Meanwhile, Old Dominion just had their best offensive performance in years. Joseph is spreading the ball around to multiple receivers. They've got explosive playmakers who can house it from anywhere on the field. And their defense is creating short fields with opportunistic plays. That safety they scored when the punter bobbled the snap? That's the kind of heads-up football that wins you games you're not supposed to win. The concerning thing for Virginia Tech is that pattern of struggling against non-conference Power 4 opponents. 15 straight losses since 2017. That's not a fluke. That's a trend. And when you're laying this many points, you can't afford to have those demons creeping into your head. Look, I'm not saying Old Dominion is going to march into Blacksburg and win outright, but 14.5 points? That feels like the market is betting on the Virginia Tech brand rather than what we actually saw last week. The Hokies showed they can play well for 30 minutes, but college football games are 60 minutes long. With that 9.3 value gap screaming at us from the power rankings, and Old Dominion coming off their most explosive offensive performance in years, this line feels like it's begging us to take the points. Sometimes the market gets caught up in names and narratives while the numbers are telling a completely different story. All right, so we've got App State traveling 554 miles down to Hattiesburg. And honestly, this line makes 0 sense when you dig into what these teams actually showed us in Week 2. Let's start with the obvious. Southern Miss is getting 3.5 points at home, but their home field advantage is only worth about 2 points according to the data. So we're really talking about maybe a pick'em game on a neutral field, which, that's where this gets interesting. App State just put up 503 total yards against Lindenwood. 503. A.J. Swan threw for 292. Rashad Dubinion had 194 on the ground, including a 72-yard house call on literally the first play of the game. But here's the thing, and this is huge. They turned the ball over 4 times. 4 times against an FCS team that's 0-2. Now, Southern Miss? They're coming off what looks like a really solid bounce-back performance. Braylon Braxton was efficient, 20 of 30 for 214 and 3 touchdowns. They had that early punt block for a touchdown, which, special teams can absolutely flip games like this. But here's what's bothering me about this spread. The power rankings have App State with real separation here. We're talking about a 4.7 discrepancy between what the computers think and what Vegas is telling us. That's not small money. That's a massive disagreement. And when I look at Southern Miss's win, they gave up 191 rushing yards to Jackson State. Jackson State, an FCS program. Meanwhile, App State's defense, 8 sacks. Held Lindenwood to negative rushing yards, -1 yards rushing total. So you've got App State with this explosive offensive potential. Dubinion breaks a 72-yarder on the first snap. That tells you about the big playability. But then you've got these turnovers, which, look, against Southern Miss's defense, that could be the difference in a close game. Here's my read on this. App State's offense is legitimately dangerous when they protect the football. The question is whether they've cleaned up those ball security issues from week 2. Because if they have, this Southern Miss defense that just gave up nearly 200 rushing yards to an FCS team, that's going to be a problem. The weather's perfect. 72 degrees, light winds from the south-southwest at 5 miles per hour, no precipitation. This is going to be about execution, not conditions. Southern Miss showed they can finish drives in the red zone, which is crucial. 3 short touchdown passes from Braxton, plus that Robert Briggs rushing score. But App State's pass rush, 8 sacks, that's the kind of pressure that can completely disrupt an offensive rhythm. I keep coming back to that 4.7 gap between the power rankings and the betting market. When you see that kind of disagreement, usually the sharp money knows something. And right now, the computers are screaming that App State is being undervalued here. The narrative wants you to take Southern Miss getting points at home after a nice bounce-back win. But the numbers are telling a different story. App State's got more talent, better offensive explosiveness, and a defense that can create havoc up front. If App State cleaned up those turnovers from week 2, and that's a big if, this line feels like it's giving us too many points with the better team on the road. So we've got Jacksonville State heading down to Statesboro to take on Georgia Southern, and the betting market is telling us a very different story than what the numbers suggest. The Eagles are getting 3.5 at home, but here's the thing. The power rankings say Georgia Southern should actually be favored by about 3 points themselves. That's a massive 6.5-point swing we're looking at here. When you see that kind of disagreement between the market and the fundamentals, well, something's got to give. Let me paint the picture of what we're really dealing with. Jacksonville State just dominated Liberty in a game that showcased exactly what they do best, and what terrifies me about them as an opponent. Cam Cook absolutely bulldozed the Flames for 195 yards and 2 touchdowns, anchoring a 338-yard rushing attack that just controlled every aspect of that game. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. The Gamecocks are winning with a completely one-dimensional offense. Gavin Wimsatt threw the ball exactly 12 times, completed 6 of them for 52 yards. That's not a passing game. That's basically a suggestion of one. Now, you might think, well, if they're dominating on the ground, who cares about the passing game? And normally I'd agree with you. But Georgia Southern just got absolutely torched by USC for 755 yards and 7 plays longer than 35 yards. If you can't stop big plays, you better believe Jacksonville State is going to try to break a few runs. The Eagles' secondary got destroyed, and I mean destroyed, allowing touchdown catches of 62 and 74 yards in just the first quarter against the Trojans. But here's the thing that's making me pause. Despite getting blown out by a combined score of 101-34 in their first two games, Georgia Southern still moved the ball. They put up 377 yards against USC and found the end zone twice in the first half. So we've got this fascinating matchup between Jacksonville State's ground and pound attack that can control games versus a Georgia Southern team that can't stop big plays but has shown they can score when they need to. The situational stuff is working against Jacksonville State too. They're dealing with that -1 hour time adjustment heading east, and while that's not huge, it's another small thing working against them. Meanwhile, Georgia Southern finally gets to play at home after two brutal road games against Power 4 opponents. The weather shouldn't be a major factor. 70 degrees at kickoff with some moderate wind from the southeast. Maybe makes the deep ball a touch harder, but nothing that should dramatically shift how either team wants to play. Here's my read on this thing. Jacksonville State is the better team right now. Their rushing attack is legitimate, and their defense showed they can create turnovers and capitalize on mistakes. But they also showed some concerning fourth-quarter lapses against Liberty, allowing explosive plays when they should have been putting the game away. Georgia Southern has all the makings of a team that could hang around and make this interesting, especially at home. They've got weapons. Camden Brown caught 2 touchdowns in the first half against USC. And if they can force Jacksonville State into obvious passing situations, well, that's not exactly where the Gamecocks want to live. The 3.5 points feels like a lot for a team that just gave up 7 explosive plays to USC. But when the power rankings and the market disagree this dramatically, sometimes the market knows something we don't. Maybe it's factoring in just how bad Georgia Southern looked defensively, or maybe it's giving Jacksonville State too much credit for beating a Liberty team that might not be as good as we thought. I keep coming back to this, though. Georgia Southern at home, getting 3.5, with a legitimate chance to move the ball and keep pace. That's a lot of value if you believe the Eagles can just be competitive. All right, so we've got Illinois hosting Western Michigan on Saturday. And honestly, this was screaming blowout when you dig into what happened to both teams last week. Let's start with Western Michigan because, this is brutal. They just lost in overtime to North Texas, and not because they got outplayed, but because they beat themselves. 2 massive penalties by Jarvarius Sims and OT pass interference, then an unsportsmanlike conduct, basically gift-wrapped 1st and goal for North Texas. That's how you lose games you should win, and now they're sitting at 0-2. Here's the thing, though. Western Michigan isn't totally without talent. Jalen Buckley ran for 112 yards. They put up 216 on the ground total, and quarterback Brock Lowry actually looks decent with 3 total touchdowns. But, and this is huge, they can't finish games. They had a 27-24 lead late in the 4th, then allowed North Texas to march 65 yards and 68 yards on back-to-back drives to tie it up. That's not bad luck, that's a defense that folds under pressure. Now flip to Illinois. Completely different story. They went into Duke and got punched in the mouth early. Down at halftime, getting sacked 4 times, looked like they might be in trouble. But here's where it gets interesting for this matchup. They outscored Duke 31-6 in the second half. Luke Altmaier threw for 296 yards, 3 touchdowns, and the defense forced 5 turnovers. The turnovers are key here because Coach Bielema literally showed his team film of Duke's ball security issues during prep. That's the kind of game planning that translates, and guess what? Western Michigan just threw the ball away against North Texas in crunch time. So we've got Illinois, ranked number 11, coming off a statement road win where they showed they can make adjustments, hosting a Western Michigan team that's 0-2 and has proven they'll hand you the game if you just wait long enough. The power rankings have this as a true mismatch. Illinois should be in blowout territory, and the 2.6 home field advantage at Memorial Stadium only makes it worse for the Broncos. Weather's not a factor. 70 degrees, light winds, perfect conditions for Illinois to do whatever they want. Here's my read. Western Michigan might keep it close for a half, just like they did against North Texas. But when the pressure mounts in the second half, and it will, they're gonna crack. Illinois has shown they can take a punch and respond. Western Michigan has shown they'll throw punches at themselves. The betting market's given Illinois about 2 points of value based on the power rankings, but honestly, in a game where one team makes second-half adjustments and the other team makes second-half mistakes, that feels like all the edge you need. So here's the thing about Ohio State, minus 36.5 against Ohio. This isn't just another cupcake game where you blindly hammer the favorite and move on. There's actually some real betting nuance here that most people are going to miss. First, let's talk about what we learned from both teams last week, because it tells us everything about how this spread got set. Ohio State absolutely obliterated Grambling State 70-0, and I mean, Julian Sion completed his first 16 passes, finished 18 of 19 for 306 yards and 4 touchdowns in the first half alone. That's video game numbers against, admittedly, a team with only 63 scholarships going up against a $35 million roster. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Ohio, the Bobcats, they actually showed some real grit against Rutgers. Lost 38-31, but Parker Navarro looked like a legitimate dual-threat quarterback. 239 passing, 93 rushing, 4 total touchdowns. The kid's got serious escapability, and he spread the ball to 8 different receivers. That's not the profile of a team that's going to roll over. Now, the market's telling us something here. Power rankings suggest Ohio State should be favored by over 40 points, but the line opened at 36.5. That's a 4-point disagreement, which in a game like this is actually significant value on the Buckeyes if you believe the numbers. But, and this is where most sharp bettors are going to lean, these massive spreads and mismatches are notoriously tricky. Ohio State's going to be up big early, no question. But what happens in the fourth quarter when it's 56-14 and Ryan Day's pulling starters? Suddenly you've got walk-ons trying to cover a 40-point spread while Ohio's still fighting with their scholarship players. The Bobcats showed they can convert third downs, 5 of 10 against Rutgers. And Navarro's mobility means they're not going to go 3 and out every possession like Grambling State did. Ohio managed 31 points against a Big Ten defense, so they're not completely overmatched offensively. Weather's perfect in Columbus. 74 degrees, light winds, no precipitation. So we're not getting any help from Mother Nature slowing down Ohio State's passing attack. Here's my read on this. The first half spread might be the sharper play. Ohio State's going to come out guns blazing after that lackluster performance against Texas 2 weeks ago. They need to make a statement, and the first 30 minutes is when they're going to pour it on with their starting lineup. The full game number? It's right on the edge of being too big. Yeah, Ohio State has better players at every single position, but 36.5 points requires sustained execution for 4 quarters, and that's tough when you're managing a blowout and trying to keep guys healthy for the Big Ten grind ahead. The over-under sits at 59, which feels low given Ohio State's offensive ceiling, but remember, if this game gets out of hand early, both teams are going to throttle back. Clock management becomes more important than moving the ball. So Rice just got absolutely demolished by Houston 35-9, and now they're hosting Prairie View A&M. And honestly, this is about as obvious as a bounce-back spot gets for the Owls. Look, I watched that Houston game, and Rice's problems weren't structural. They were execution-based. Scott Abel even said it himself after the game. He needed to make adjustments sooner. But here's the thing that caught my eye. They actually ran the ball pretty well against Houston. 177 rushing yards with Dalen Alexander and Quentin Jackson, both going over 50 yards each. That's a solid foundation, especially when you're about to face a Prairie View team that's, well, let's just say they're not exactly Houston. The passing game, though, that's where things get interesting. Chase Jenkins went 10 of 12 for 50 yards. 50 yards. That's not a quarterback struggling with accuracy. That's a team that completely abandoned any vertical passing game. And you know what? Against Prairie View, they probably won't need to abandon it. Here's what's really fascinating about this spot. Rice is coming off a rivalry game loss where their defense actually showed up early. They forced 5 punts and a turnover on downs in Houston's first 6 drives. The collapse came later, sure, but that defensive effort early tells me this team has some fight in them. And now they're getting Prairie View at home. The power rankings have Rice in the dominant tier for this matchup, which makes sense. Prairie View is the kind of team where Rice should be laying a significant number, and this feels like one of those games where the line is going to be more about how much Rice wins by rather than if they win. But here's where it gets tricky for bettors, and this is why I love this spot. Rice is going to be motivated to make a statement after getting embarrassed by their crosstown rival. Coach Abell knows he needs to get his team's confidence back, And what better way than putting up some points against an overmatched opponent? The weather's going to be muggy, 81 degrees at kickoff with that Houston humidity, but both teams are dealing with the same conditions. Wind's only 7 miles per hour from the south, so that's not going to impact anything significantly. What I'm really watching for is whether Rice can put together a complete game. They showed they can run the ball effectively, their defense has some bite when engaged, and Jenkins doesn't need to be a world beater. He just needs to manage the game and maybe, throw for more than 50 yards this time. The narrative here is simple. Rice got punched in the mouth by Houston, and now they get to take out their frustration on a much weaker opponent at home. That's a dangerous combination for anyone thinking about taking Prairie View plus whatever massive number they're going to be getting. This feels like one of those games where Rice starts fast and never looks back. The question isn't really who wins. It's whether Rice can cover what's going to be a substantial spread, and whether they can put up enough points to hit an over that's probably going to be set pretty high. Georgia State hosting Murray State this week, and honestly, this line screams trap game to me. The Panthers are sitting at 0-2 after that brutal collapse against Memphis. Up 17-16 at the half, then gave up 24 straight to lose by 3 touchdowns. Now here's where it gets interesting for bettors. The power rankings have Georgia State in what they're calling the dominant team tier, which sounds great until you dig into what actually happened in that Memphis game. TJ Finley looked fantastic early, 10 for 10 to start, then gets banged up and suddenly their entire offensive rhythm falls apart. And that's the thing that's got me concerned about laying points here. Finley did come back in the second half, finished 21 of 29 for 201 yards, so the injury might not be as serious as it looked. But backup Cameron Brown actually showed some real dual threat ability. 8 of 12 passing, led the team in rushing, threw a touchdown, ran for another one. The question is, does that depth make Georgia State more dangerous, or does it signal that Finley's health is still a real concern? Here's what's really bugging me about this spot. Murray State's coming in with a -1 hour time adjustment, not exactly jet lag, but still a disruption to their routine. Meanwhile, Georgia State's home field advantage is just 1.8, way below the national average. So we're not talking about some intimidating environment that's going to help the Panthers cover a big spread. But here's the kicker. There's no betting line available yet for this matchup. That tells me the books are probably waiting to see more information, likely about Finley's health status and how Georgia State responds to that second-half meltdown. When I look at that Memphis game, what stands out isn't just that they blew a lead. It's how they blew it. 24 unanswered points in the second half, including a pick-6 in garbage time. That's not just bad execution. That's a team that completely lost its composure when things got tough. And you know what? Teams that fold like that in big moments, they tend to do it again, especially when they're expected to dominate against an inferior opponent. The mental side of this game is huge right now for Georgia State. Murray State might not be world beaters, but they're getting Georgia State at the perfect time. Confidence shaken, starting quarterback's health questionable, and coming off a performance where they showed they can't close games. The weather's going to be perfect, 81 degrees, barely any wind, so no external factors to worry about. If I'm handicapping this game, I'm waiting for that line to come out and seeing where the market lands. But my gut tells me this Georgia State team is going to be overvalued after that competitive first-half narrative from the Memphis game. Sometimes the most dangerous bet is the one that looks easy on paper. So we've got a fascinating bounce-back narrative brewing in South Bend this Saturday. Notre Dame, coming off that gut-punch loss to Miami where they couldn't close the deal, hosting a Texas A&M team that's riding high after throttling Utah State but dealing with some quarterback uncertainty. Let me tell you what's really interesting about this matchup. We're looking at two teams that show completely different versions of themselves last week. The Irish had freshman C.J. Carr making his first start, and honestly, the kid showed flashes. 221 yards, 2 touchdown passes, plus that clutch rushing score to tie it up late. But here's the thing. That offense went through these long, painful stretches where they just couldn't sustain drives. Miami controlled the clock with those back-to-back 75-yard scoring drives, and it completely disrupted Notre Dame's rhythm. Now flip over to College Station, where Marcel Reed was absolutely cooking Utah State before he took that awkward hit in the third quarter. 4 total touchdowns, including some beautiful downfield strikes, a 34-yarder, then another touchdown pass. The Aggies finally looked like they found that vertical passing game Mike Elko's been talking about all season. But here's where it gets dicey for Texas A&M. Reed's status is questionable, and while Elko says he expects him to play, that's coach speak, you know? The market's telling an interesting story here. Notre Dame opened as small home favorites, and the power rankings actually suggest they should be getting a bit more respect. We're looking at about 1.5 points of value on the Irish based on their underlying metrics versus this spread. Plus, that home field advantage in South Bend is legitimate, 3 full points, which is more than your typical college venue. But let's dig into what really matters for bettors. The defensive matchups are where this game gets decided. Texas A&M's defense was absolutely dominant last week. Cassius Howell with 3 consecutive sacks on the same drive, something we haven't seen since 2015. 6 sacks total held Utah State to just 78 rushing yards. That's a massive bounce back from allowing 203 to UTSA in Week 1. Meanwhile, Notre Dame's defense couldn't get that crucial stop when it mattered most. Miami marched 46 yards in 10 plays for the game winner, and the Irish just couldn't force that turnover or 3 and out when the game was hanging in the balance. Here's my read on the value. If Reed plays and he's healthy, this line feels about right. The Aggies have that explosive passing attack with KC Concepcion and Mario Craver, both transfers who found immediate chemistry with Reed. But if Reed's compromised or doesn't go, this number shifts dramatically in Notre Dame's favor. The weather's a non-factor, mid to upper 60s, light winds, essentially perfect football conditions. And while it's worth noting the Aggies are making that 900-plus mile trek, they're SEC-level athletes who can handle the travel. What I keep coming back to is Notre Dame's resilience. Yeah, they lost a heartbreaker, but they rallied from 14 down to tie it up with 3 minutes left. CJ Carr showed he can handle pressure, and now he's got a week of preparation under his belt instead of being thrown into the fire. The betting value? I'm leaning toward the Irish laying the small number, especially if there's any lingering uncertainty about Reed's health status. This Notre Dame team is better than their recent road struggles suggest. And at home, with a young quarterback who's got nothing to lose after that Miami performance, I think they find a way to get it done. Billy Napier's seat just got scorching hot, and now Florida's walking straight into Death Valley. The Gators just blew a game at home to USF, a team they should have beaten by 3 touchdowns, and somehow this line's only sitting at LSU minus 4.5. That feels generous to Florida. Let me break down what just happened in Gainesville because it tells us everything about where this team's head is at. Florida's up 14-3 in the fourth quarter against South Florida, and they completely implode. 11 penalties for 103 yards, including a player getting ejected for spitting during USF's game-winning drive. When you're committing pass interference and getting tossed for spitting in crunch time, that's not execution problems. That's mental fragility. And here's the kicker. Florida defenders were literally staring at the sideline while USF's receiver ran past them for a 66-yard touchdown. You can't make this stuff up. That's a team that's already checked out, and they haven't even hit SEC play yet. Now they're making a 532-mile trip to Baton Rouge, where they haven't won since 2016. The Tigers are sitting at home coming off a weird performance against Louisiana Tech, where they should have won by 5 touchdowns but only managed 23 points. Brian Kelly wasn't happy. He said there was a lack of execution by coaches and players alike. But here's the thing, LSU's defense has been legitimately excellent. They've got nearly 6 quarters of shutout football before allowing that late touchdown to Tech. They held Clemson scoreless in the second half of their opener. This isn't just beating up on cupcakes. This is a unit that can create havoc. The weather's going to be brutal for Florida, too. 78 degrees at kickoff sounds nice, but we're talking about 70% humidity in Louisiana. These Gators are already mentally soft, and now they're going to be sweating through their uniforms from warm-ups onward. Power rankings suggest LSU should be getting about 6 points at home, but we're only laying 4.5. That's moderate value on the Tigers, especially with that 3-point home field advantage boost they get in Death Valley. The real concern for LSU? Garrett Nussmeier threw his first pick of the season against Tech and looked inconsistent throughout. Kelly publicly said Nussmeier knows he's got to play better, which, yikes, when your coach is calling you out after beating Louisiana Tech, That's not exactly a confidence builder. But Florida's offensive line couldn't protect their quarterback against USF's pass rush. They managed just 355 total yards against a team that shouldn't even sniff their jockstrap. Now they're facing an LSU defense that's been shutting people down. The injury situation for LSU is worth monitoring too. Center Braylon Moore hurt his ankle, tight end Trey'Dez Green tweaked his knee, and edge rusher Jamari Butler is dealing with something. But honestly, Florida's so mentally broken right now that I'm not sure it matters. Look, Billy Napier's at 20-20 overall as Florida's coach. He's got arguably the most talented roster in the SEC East, and he just lost at home to a Conference USA team. The boosters are circling, the fans are furious, and now he's walking into the most hostile environment in college football. This feels like a spot where LSU doesn't just cover, they might blow the doors off. Florida's penalty problems, mental mistakes, and complete lack of discipline and pressure moments, that's going to get exposed in Baton Rouge. The Tigers at -4.5 might be the easiest money we see all weekend. So Eastern Michigan just lost to an FCS team, and now they're getting 11.5 points at home against Kentucky? Look, I get it. When you see a team that just got embarrassed by Long Island University, your first instinct is to fade them hard. But here's the thing that's got my attention. The power rankings are screaming that this line is off by more than a touchdown. Let me break down what actually happened in that Eastern Michigan disaster. Yeah, they lost 28-23 to LIU, but this wasn't some complete meltdown where they got boat raced. They were in this game until the very end, failed the 2-point conversion, couldn't recover the onside kick. The execution was bad, sure, but the fight was there. And here's what really jumps out. LIU exploited them with a 2-quarterback system. Ethan Greenwood and Lucas Stanzani combined for 158 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. That's a very specific problem. Dual-threat quarterbacks carving up their defense. Now, Kentucky, they're dealing with their own issues. Zach Calzada's banged up with a shoulder injury, and even when he was healthy, this offense has been anemic. 659 total yards through 2 games? That's brutal. They're averaging under 330 yards per game. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Kentucky's on an 8-game SEC losing streak, and now they're laying double digits against a team that just had their confidence shattered. The market is basically saying Eastern Michigan is so bad after that FCS loss that Kentucky can blow them out despite their own offensive struggles. I'm not buying it. Look at the situational dynamics here. Eastern Michigan gets to stay home, lick their wounds, and face a Kentucky team that's been equally underwhelming. The Wildcats had some defensive highlights. Ty Bryant picked off 2 passes, but those turnovers masked how limited they've been moving the football. The power rankings suggest this should be closer to a 4 or 5 point game. That's a massive 11-point discrepancy from where the market has it. And honestly, when you're getting that kind of value, you have to ask yourself, is the market overreacting to one bad result? Eastern Michigan showed they can move the ball when they need to. Dante McMillan had that 40-yard touchdown run. Noah Kim connected with Jamarian Wheeler late. The pieces are there. They just need to put it together for 60 minutes instead of falling behind early like they did against LIU. Kentucky's going to try to establish Seth McGowan on the ground. He had 88 yards and 2 scores last week, but if Eastern Michigan can force them into obvious passing situations with Calzada's shoulder questionable, this becomes a much more competitive game than the spread suggests. The weather's perfect in Ypsilanti. 76 degrees, 3-mile-per-hour winds from the south. No excuses there. This comes down to whether Eastern Michigan can channel that embarrassment into focus, or if Kentucky's power running game can control the clock and avoid the shootout, they probably can't win. 11.5 points feels like the market punishing Eastern Michigan for that LIU debacle, while ignoring Kentucky's own red flags. Sometimes the best value comes when everyone's looking the other way. Louisiana Tech versus New Mexico State tonight, and honestly, this line feels off to me. The Bulldogs are laying 4.5 at home, but I'm seeing some real value on the other side. Let's start with what we know about these teams coming in. New Mexico State just pulled off a clutch comeback win where Logan Fife led them 75 yards in the final 3 minutes. That's the kind of fourth-quarter execution that wins you games late in the season. Louisiana Tech, meanwhile, just got boat raced by LSU, but, and here's the interesting part, their defense actually hung tough for most of that game. The Bulldogs kept it within 10 points deep into the third quarter against the number 3 team in the country. That's not nothing. Their punt team was absolutely elite, pinning LSU inside their own 10-yard line 4 different times. When you're getting field position like that, you can stay competitive with anybody. But here's where it gets interesting for tonight. New Mexico State's offense is completely one-dimensional right now. 5 threw for 248 yards, which is solid, but they managed just 39 rushing yards on 26 carries. That's 1.5 yards per carry. You literally can't get much worse than that. So you've got Louisiana Tech coming off a performance where their defense looked legit against elite competition, facing a team that basically can't run the football at all. That should be a recipe for the home favorite to cover, right? Well, not so fast. Coach Sonny Cumbie admitted after the LSU game that their offensive execution was not where it needs to be for us to win a conference championship. They managed just 154 total yards against the Tigers. Now granted, that's LSU's defense, but still, that's concerning. And here's what's really bothering me about this spread. New Mexico State is getting 4.5 points, but the power rankings suggest they should only be getting about 3. That's over a point of value, which is significant in college football. The situational stuff matters too. The Aggies are coming off a short week, traveling 823 miles to Ruston. That's not ideal. But they're also riding the confidence of that comeback win, and sometimes momentum trumps logistics. Louisiana Tech's special teams could be the X factor here. If they can consistently pin New Mexico State deep and force long fields, that one-dimensional offense is going to struggle. But if the Aggies can get into any kind of rhythm through the air, and Fife showed he can handle pressure, this becomes a much tighter game than the spread suggests. The weather's perfect tonight, so we won't have any external factors messing with either team's game plan. This comes down to execution, and honestly, I think we're getting too many points with the road team. New Mexico State has shown they can win ugly, they can execute in crunch time, and they're facing a Louisiana Tech team that's still figuring out their offensive identity after getting dominated by LSU. 4.5 feels like an overreaction to that blowout loss. I'm leaning toward the Aggies getting the points. Sometimes the best bets are the ones that feel uncomfortable, and backing a short rest road team definitely qualifies. But that's exactly why the value might be there. All right, so we've got East Carolina heading to Conway to take on Coastal Carolina, and honestly, this line makes 0 sense when you dig into what happened last weekend. Let me paint the picture here. East Carolina just dropped 56 points on Campbell. Yeah, it's FCS, but they did it the right way. Caden Hauser was surgical, 25 of 35, with that beautiful 55-yard bomb to Brock Spalding. 4 different running backs found the end zone. London Montgomery punching in 2 from short yardage. This offense looked balanced, efficient, and most importantly, they could finish drives. Now flip over to Coastal Carolina and, yikes. They beat Charleston Southern 13-0, and somehow that was disappointing. Think about that for a second. They were 28.5-point favorites against an FCS team that's lost 12 straight games and is 0-28 all-time against FBS competition. They won by 13, but here's where it gets really ugly. MJ Morris, their Maryland transfer quarterback, threw 3 picks on just 22 attempts against Charleston Southern, 3 interceptions. Against a team that gave up 45 to Vanderbilt the week before. The backup, Tad Hudson, had to come in and actually scored their only touchdown on a 4-yard run. So we've got East Carolina coming off a confidence-boosting blowout where their offense clicked on all cylinders, going against a Coastal team whose starting quarterback might be seeing ghosts after that disaster performance. And yet, Coastal Carolina is favored by 3 at home. This is where the power rankings get interesting. They actually have East Carolina as the better team. We're talking about 6.4 points of disagreement between the market and the advanced metrics. That's massive. The power rankings are basically screaming that East Carolina should be favored by about 3.5 on a neutral field. Now, Coastal does get home field advantage, but it's only worth 2.3 points below average for college football. So even with that boost, the numbers suggest East Carolina should be getting points, not laying them. Look, I get it. Coastal Carolina has had some solid seasons recently, and there's always hesitation to fade a home favorite. But when you've got a quarterback throwing 3 picks against Charleston Southern while the other team's offense is humming with 4 different guys finding the end zone, that's a pretty clear talent and momentum gap. The weather shouldn't be a factor, 70 degrees at kickoff, maybe a little humid at 77%, but nothing these guys can't handle. Light winds from the east might make deep balls slightly tougher, but we're talking 5 to 10 mile-per-hour gusts, not game-changing. What really sells me on East Carolina here is the red zone execution. They converted multiple times from inside the 5-yard line, which tells you they can punch it in when it matters. Meanwhile, Coastal managed just 13 points against a defense that, well, let's just say Charleston Southern isn't exactly known for their defensive prowess. The narrative writes itself. Bounce-back team with a clicking offense, balanced attack, and a quarterback who's finding his rhythm, going against a squad whose signal caller just had a nightmare performance against inferior competition. Sometimes the market gets it wrong, and when power rankings disagree by 6.5 points, that's usually a pretty good indicator. East Carolina +3 feels like the right side. And honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if they win this thing outright. So we've got UMass making a 978-mile trek to Iowa City this weekend. And honestly, this line is telling a story that goes way beyond the obvious mismatch. Iowa opened as 24.5-point favorites, and that number hasn't budged much. But here's what's interesting. The power rankings actually suggest Iowa should be laying closer to 27 or 28 points. That's about 2.8 points of value on Iowa, which is, well, it's moderate value in a spot where the public usually inflates these big spreads. Let me walk you through what happened in Week 1 because it explains everything about this number. UMass hired Joe Harasimiak as their new head coach, and his debut was, let's call it educational. They actually started strong against Temple, took a 10-7 lead after the first quarter with a nice 10-play touchdown drive. Brandon Rose looked decent, went 23 of 38 for 193 yards. But then, complete collapse. Temple outscored them 35-0 the rest of the way. The defense couldn't stop anything, gave up 42 points total, and Temple's quarterback, Evan Simon, threw 6 touchdown passes. 6. Their running back, Jay Ducker, ran for 128 yards, and this was at home at McGurk Stadium. Now flip over to Iowa, and you've got a different kind of concern. Mark Gronowski, the South Dakota State transfer, is really struggling to adapt to Big Ten football. He's 21 of 39 for just 127 yards through 2 games. That's not good. Against Iowa State, he was 13 of 24 for 83 yards, and Iowa still only lost by a field goal. Here's what's fascinating about that Iowa State game, though. Iowa actually showed some resilience. They tied at 13-13 in the third quarter, moved the ball 85 yards for a touchdown when they needed to. But they couldn't finish drives consistently, and their defense gave up a 55-yard, 6.5-minute game-winning drive when it mattered most. The weather looks perfect for football, 72 degrees at kickoff, maybe some light wind from the south around 6 miles per hour, gusting to 13. Nothing that's going to affect this game meaningfully. So here's my read on this spot. Iowa's got major offensive limitations with Gronowski still learning the system, but UMass showed they can't stop anyone after that first quarter collapse. The ground game for Iowa looks solid. Jazon Patterson had 60 yards on 11 carries against Iowa State, and that might be their path to covering a big number. The thing about these massive spreads is they're usually about pace of scoring, not just talent differential. UMass couldn't sustain anything offensively after their opening drive against Temple. If Iowa can establish Patterson in the running game early and their defense shows up at home, remember, they've got a strong 2.7 home field advantage. This could get ugly fast. The value suggests taking Iowa, but in these extreme mismatch spots, sometimes the market knows something the power rankings don't capture. UMass is desperate for their first win under Harasimiak, and sometimes desperation creates competitive intensity that numbers can't measure. Still, when you're getting nearly 3 points of value on a team playing at home against a squad that gave up 35 unanswered points in their head coach's debut, that's tough to ignore. Navy rolls into Tulsa on Saturday as 8-point road favorites, and honestly, this line feels about right when you dig into what happened last week for both teams. Let's start with the midshipmen, because what Blake Horvath did against UAB was pretty special. 6 of 8 passing for 168 yards, including a 63-yard touchdown bomb, while also grinding out 72 rushing yards and 2 scores on the ground. That's the kind of dual-threat performance that makes Navy dangerous, you know? But here's the thing that really caught my attention. They were down 24-14 at halftime, then completely shut out UAB in the second half while scoring 24 unanswered points. That's not just talent, that's coaching. Navy made adjustments at the break, and their defense forced 3 turnovers in the final 30 minutes, including 2 picks. When you see a team flip the script that dramatically, it tells you something about their mental toughness. And let's not forget, they did all this with 2-hour-long weather delays in the first half that could have thrown them completely off rhythm. Now, Tulsa, this is where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The Golden Hurricane actually had New Mexico State right where they wanted them last week, up 14-13 with 7.5 minutes left. But they couldn't close. New Mexico State marched 75 yards in 11 plays for the game winner. And that's the kind of collapse that sticks with the team, especially when you're facing a much better opponent the following week. The adult quarterback thing with Kirk Francis and Baylor Hayes is intriguing on paper. Both guys completed 13 passes. They combined for 229 through the air, and Hayes showed that dual-threat ability with his legs. But here's my concern. When you need to execute in crunch time, having 2 quarterbacks can sometimes mean you don't really have one. There's something to be said for rhythm and timing, and I'm not convinced this system gives them that consistency when it matters most. From a power rankings perspective, Navy sits in what we call the dominant team tier, while Tulsa is clearly a step below. The analytics suggest there's about 2.5 points of value on Navy at -8, which isn't huge, but it's worth noting. And Tulsa's home field advantage, it's only 1.9, well below the national average, so they're not getting much help from playing at home. Here's where I think this game gets decided. Navy's ground game depth. Yeah, Horvath's the catalyst. But Alex Texa led the team with 111 rushing yards last week and scored the clincher on an 82-yard fourth-quarter drive. When you can control the clock and keep hammering away with multiple guys, that's a recipe for covering spreads on the road. Tulsa's defense couldn't contain New Mexico State's Logan Fife, who completed 27 of 44 passes. If they can't pressure the quarterback or get consistent coverage against the Aggies, what are they going to do against Navy's option attack? The midshipmen don't just run one style. They'll test you in multiple ways, and Horvath's arm gives them another dimension entirely. The situational stuff favors Navy too. They're coming off a longer week of prep while Tulsa had normal rest, and that extra time to install wrinkles in the option game could pay dividends. Sure, Navy's traveling over 1,000 miles, but this is a service academy team that's used to travel and adversity. Weather's going to be perfect. 84 degrees, light winds, no precipitation, so no excuses there for either team. This comes down to execution, and right now Navy looks like the team that knows how to finish games while Tulsa is still trying to figure out how to close the deal when they have a chance. At -8, I think Navy covers. They've got the better quarterback, more offensive versatility, and they just showed they can make adjustments when things get tough. Tulsa's going to need to play a nearly perfect game to keep this within a touchdown, and based on what we saw last week, I'm not sure they have that in them just yet. Utah rolls into Laramie this Saturday as 24-point favorites, and honestly, that number feels light when you start digging into what we're dealing with here. Look, I get it. 24 points is a massive spread in college football. But here's the thing that's got me thinking. Utah just hung 63 on Southern Utah while holding out 5 starters due to injury. Devin Dampier looked completely comfortable in his first home start, going 17 of 23 with 3 touchdowns. When your backup quarterback is coming in and contributing 2 rushing scores, that's depth that most teams just don't have. And Wyoming? Well, they're sitting at 2-0, which looks nice on paper, until you realize they beat Northern Colorado and Northern Iowa. I mean, we're talking about FCS competition here. Their starting quarterback, Caden Anderson, left the game in the fourth quarter after taking a big hit. And while backup Landon Sims looked fine in mop-up duty, that's not exactly the kind of depth test you want before facing a Pac-12 powerhouse. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. The power rankings are screaming that this should be an absolute bloodbath. We're talking about a top-tier team versus what's essentially a bottom-tier Mountain West squad. Yet Wyoming's getting 2.7 points of home field advantage, which is actually above the typical home boost. That altitude in Laramie, 7,200 feet, it's real, and it affects visiting teams. The weather's going to be crisp at 51 degrees at kickoff, with winds around 6 miles per hour from the south-southwest. Nothing too crazy, but those gusts up to 13 could make some of those longer throws a bit trickier. Now here's my read on this. Utah's offense looked absolutely explosive last week. 518 total yards with that go-go pace they've implemented. When you've got Wayshawn Parker hauling in 52-yard touchdowns and your defense is still returning picks for scores, that's 22 straight seasons with a pick six, by the way. You're just operating on a different level. Wyoming's ground game showed some nice balance with 3 different backs contributing, but let's be honest about the competition level. When you're facing Utah's defense, which has been a Kyle Whittingham staple for years, those FCS rushing stats don't translate. The value here? Well, the numbers suggest Wyoming's getting about 2.1 points of value based on power rankings versus the actual spread. That's moderate value, not screaming value. And when you factor in that Utah's probably going to be motivated to make a statement after being ranked just 25th in the AP poll, I'm having trouble seeing where Wyoming keeps this within 3 touchdowns. Here's what I keep coming back to. Utah held out 5 starters and still dominated. Their depth chart is built for Pac-12 warfare, not Mountain West scrimmages. Devin Dampier is already showing chemistry with his receivers. The running game's got multiple contributors, and that defense, they're just going to create short fields all day long. Wyoming special teams did block a punt last week, which led to points, but against Utah's athletes, I'm not seeing that kind of execution translating. The Cowboys need everything to go perfect to stay competitive, while Utah can probably play their backups in the fourth quarter and still cover. The altitude's real, the home crowd will be into it, but when you're spotting 24 points to a team that just put up 63 while resting starters, that's the kind of depth and talent differential that shows up regardless of venue. Utah's got the better players, better coaching, and they're coming off a performance that suggests they're ready to make some noise this season. So, let me paint you a picture here. Duke just got absolutely humiliated by Illinois, 45-13. And the most telling stat isn't even the final score. It's that they committed 5 turnovers and have 0 takeaways through 2 games. 0. That's a -6 turnover margin, which is basically basketball territory. But here's where it gets interesting for us as bettors. The market's telling a story that doesn't quite match what we just watched. Duke is getting 2.5 points on the road against Tulane, and according to the power rankings, these teams are essentially dead even. In fact, Duke actually grades out slightly better, so why are we getting points? Well, Tulane's got this massive 3-point home field advantage, way higher than the usual college bump, and honestly, that might be justified. They're sitting pretty at 2-0, with Jake Retzlaff doing his dual threat thing, putting up over 200 total yards last week. But, and this is a big but, they nearly blew a 16-point lead to South Alabama in the final 10 minutes. Here's what's fascinating about Duke's disaster against Illinois. Yeah, the turnovers were brutal, but Darian Mensah threw for 334 yards and 2 touchdowns. The kid can sling it. And this week, he's going back to face his former team at Tulane. That revenge game narrative is real, especially for quarterbacks. The weather down in New Orleans is going to be typical. 78 degrees, muggy as hell, 66% humidity. Players are going to be sweating buckets from the first snap, which usually favors the more conditioned team. But with both squads coming off long weeks, that edge disappears. So where's the value? Duke's getting 1.8 points of value based on the power rankings versus this spread. That's not massive, but it's there. And look, I get why people are scared off Duke after that Illinois debacle, but sometimes the market overreacts to blowouts, especially when the underlying metrics suggest a closer game should have happened. Tulane's defense gave up 31 points to South Alabama and looked shaky late. Duke moves the ball. They just keep giving it away. If Mensah can protect the football in this reunion game, suddenly we're talking about a Duke team that can hang around and potentially steal one on the road. The question isn't whether Duke is good. They're clearly not. It's whether they're getting enough points to make this interesting. And at plus 2.5, with that slight power ranking edge and a motivated quarterback, I think they are. So here we are, folks. Akron, heading down to Birmingham to face UAB. And honestly, this line has me scratching my head a bit. UAB's laying 14.5 points, and I'm not sure that's telling the whole story here. Look, let's be real about Akron for a second. 2 games, 0 points. That's rough. Getting blanked by Wyoming is one thing, But then Nebraska just absolutely demolished them 68-0. But here's where it gets interesting. They actually had chances against Nebraska. 2 field goal attempts, one hits the upright from 49 yards, another gets blocked from 33. I mean, we're not talking about a team that can't move the ball at all. And UAB, man, they've got their own issues. That loss to Arkansas State was brutal to watch. Up at halftime, then completely shut out in the second half. 3 turnovers, including that killer fumble right after intermission. Jalen Kitna threw for over 300 yards, but also tossed 2 picks when it mattered most. Here's what's really catching my eye, though. The power rankings suggest this should be closer to 11 points, not 14.5. That's 3.5 points of value sitting right there on Akron plus the points. UAB's home field advantage is only worth about 2 points, which is below average, so we're not getting that typical home cooking boost you'd expect. Now, I know what you're thinking. How do you back a team that hasn't scored in 2 games? Fair question. But sometimes in college football, it's not about how good a team is, it's about how overvalued their opponent might be. UAB looked completely lost in that second half against Arkansas State. No adjustments, no fight, just nothing. The weather's going to be perfect down in Birmingham, 75 degrees, light winds, no rain. So we can throw out any weather-related concerns. This comes down to pure execution and whether UAB can actually cover 2 touchdowns against a desperate Akron team. Here's my thinking. Akron's been getting outclassed, sure, but they're not as hopeless as that goose egg suggests. Meanwhile, UAB just showed they can completely fall apart when things get tough. Coach Moorhead called that Nebraska loss epic proportions, which tells me he knows his team has fight in them. They just haven't put it together yet. Sometimes the best value comes from backing the team nobody wants to touch. Akron plus 14.5 might just be one of those spots where the market's overreacting to recent results while missing the bigger picture. So here's what we're looking at. Saturday night in Logan. Air Force coming off a bye week to face a Utah State team that just got manhandled by Texas A&M. And honestly, the more I dig into this matchup, the more I like the Falcons laying the short number. Let's start with what jumped out from Air Force's last game. Josh Johnson threw for 112 yards on just 7 attempts. That's 16 yards per attempt with 2 touchdowns. We're talking about explosive plays of 40 and 62 yards. Now, Air Force has always been about the ground game, but if Johnson can suddenly stretch the field like that, that's a problem for defenses that are already struggling to contain the triple option. And speaking of problems, Utah State's offensive line is a disaster right now. Bryson Barnes got sacked 6 times against Texas A&M, 6 times, and hit 6 more after that. One defender had 3 consecutive sacks. I mean, when your quarterback is running for his life every other play, how are you supposed to establish any rhythm? Here's the thing that really concerns me about Utah State. Bronco Mendenhall came out after that loss and said they got beaten in all 3 phases. That's coach speak for we weren't ready to play. Against Air Force's disciplined, assignment-heavy offense, you can't afford to have guys out of position or missing tackles. Now, the situational stuff matters here too. We're at 4,700 feet in Logan, which definitely favors the home team. But Air Force practices at over 5,000 feet in Colorado Springs. These guys are literally conditioned for thin air. Meanwhile, Utah State just played at sea level in College Station and looked gassed. The weather's actually perfect for Air Force's style. 54 degrees at kickoff with minimal wind, no excuses, no adjustments needed. Just pure execution of their system versus a defense that's already shown it can't handle multiple offensive threats. What really sells me on this spot is Air Force's recent consistency. They've won 5 straight games and 19 straight season openers. That's not luck. That's a program that knows how to prepare and execute. Compare that to Utah State, who just gave up 44 points and couldn't protect their quarterback against basic 4-man pressure. The line opened with Air Force getting a short number on the road, and the power rankings suggest there might be some slight value there. When you've got a disciplined, well-coached team coming off extra preparation time, facing a squad that's dealing with fundamental issues up front, that's usually where you find your edge. Cade Harris had 3 total touchdowns last game, 2 rushing, 1 receiving, showing Air Force has multiple weapons beyond their traditional ground attack. If they can keep Utah State's defense honest with the passing game while controlling the clock with their option attack, this could get ugly in the second half. The elevation, the extra preparation time, the confidence from that winning streak. Everything's lining up for Air Force to make a statement on the road. Utah State's got home field advantage, sure, but when your offensive line can't block and your defense just allows 6 touchdown drives, that crowd noise doesn't mean much. So here we are with Texas State traveling to Arizona State. And honestly, this line screams value when you dig into what actually happened last week. Everyone's looking at the Sun Devils as this ranked team that should roll, but I'm seeing something completely different. Let me paint you the picture. Arizona State blew a 17-point lead to Mississippi State in the most deflating way possible. They're up 17-0, looking dominant. Then, well, they gave up 58 yards on one play with 30 seconds left to lose the game. That's not just a loss. That's the kind of gut punch that stays with a team, you know? Meanwhile, Texas State is sitting pretty at 2-0 after putting up 951 yards of total offense against UTSA, 951 yards. Brad Jackson's throwing for 286, Robert Henry's gashing people for 159 on the ground, and this kid Bo Sparks, he's out here catching 65-yard touchdowns to win games in the fourth quarter. But here's what's really interesting from a betting perspective. Arizona State's supposed to have this massive power ranking edge, but their home field advantage is only 2.2 points. That's well below average. So when the market's giving us Texas State plus 13.5, and the power rankings suggest it should be closer to 8, that's over 5 points of value sitting right there. Look, I get it. Arizona State can run the ball. Raleek Brown and Kanye Udo both went over 100 yards last week. But here's the thing. Sam Levitt completed 10 of 22 passes for 82 yards with 2 picks, 2 interceptions, against a Mississippi State team that's not exactly known for their secondary. And let's talk about that Texas State defense for a second. Everyone's focused on the 36 points they gave up, but they came through when it mattered. 3 straight incompletions to end the game, forcing a turnover on downs. That's clutch football right there. The situational stuff here is pretty standard. Both teams off long weeks. Texas State making an 860-mile trip with the 2-hour time adjustment. Nothing crazy there. Weather's perfect at 85 degrees with basically no wind. Here's my read on this game. Arizona State's confidence is shaken. They had Mississippi State dead to rights and let them walk right down the field for the game winner. Meanwhile, Texas State just survived a 6 lead change back-and-forth battle and found a way to win it in the fourth quarter. The market's still buying Arizona State as this dominant team that should cruise, but I'm seeing a Sun Devil squad that can't throw the ball effectively and just gave up the most devastating loss possible. Texas State's getting over 2 touchdowns with an offense that just dropped 950 in total yards and a defense that makes plays when the game's on the line. Sometimes the narrative and the numbers align perfectly, and this feels like one of those spots. Texas State plus 13.5, that's where the value is. Let me tell you something about this Stanford-Boston College matchup that the market is getting completely wrong. We've got Boston College laying 6.5 points on the road after flying 2,700 miles across the country, and that line is telling us a story that doesn't match what I'm seeing on film. Here's the thing. Both of these offenses are broken, but they're broken in completely different ways. Boston College can't run the ball to save their lives. 67 yards against Michigan State, 97 against Fordham. That's Fordham, an FCS team. Meanwhile, Dylan Lonergan is out there slinging it 55 times a game because they literally have no choice. But Stanford? Stanford is somehow worse. 19 rushing yards last week. 19! That's 0.8 yards per carry. Their offensive line got destroyed, giving up 7 tackles for loss. Ben Gobranson threw 2 picks and got strip sacked, and they converted 2 of 13 third downs. 2 of 13! Now here's where it gets interesting for us. The market is telling us Boston College should win this game by a touchdown on the road, but the power rankings are screaming something different. There's nearly 5 points of value on Stanford here, and I think I know why the odds makers might be overthinking this one. Boston College just played double overtime with Michigan State. That's an emotional, physical game that probably drained them more than people realize. Now they're flying across 3 time zones. That's brutal for college kids. And they're facing a Stanford team that, looked terrible against Syracuse. But they're at home, they're desperate, and sometimes desperate teams with nothing to lose can be dangerous. The thing about Stanford's offensive struggles is that they might actually match up okay against Boston College's defense. BC gave up 460 yards to Michigan State and needed double OT to win. If Stanford can just avoid the turnovers, and that's a big if, they don't need to be great, they just need to be competent. But here's what really caught my attention. Boston College's red zone execution. They had a chance to win that Michigan State game outright with a 2-point conversion in double overtime and couldn't punch it in. That's a team that might struggle to cover a big number on the road when they get down in the red zone. I'm also thinking about pace of play here. Both teams want to control the clock. BC because they can't run, so they're trying to eat clock with short passes, and Stanford because their defense needs all the help they can get. This feels like an under-the-total kind of game, especially with both offenses struggling in the red zone. The weather's perfect, 62 degrees, minimal wind, so we can throw out any environmental factors. This comes down to execution and which team can avoid beating themselves. You know what? I think the market got seduced by Boston College's offensive numbers against Michigan State. 390 yards passing, 4 touchdown passes from Lonigan. That looks impressive on paper. But when you're throwing 45 times because you gained 67 yards rushing, that's not balance, that's desperation. Stanford's had a full week to prepare at home. Frank Reich knows he needs to establish some kind of running game, and honestly, against a Boston College defense that just gave up over 200 rushing yards to Michigan State, maybe this is the week they figure it out. I'm not saying Stanford wins this game straight up, but 6.5 points feels like too many for a team traveling across the country after an emotional overtime game. Sometimes the best value is just taking the points with the home dog that everyone's writing off. So, let me paint you the picture here. We've got Minnesota traveling 2,500 miles to Berkeley, and that's not a typo, to face Cal in what looks like a classic case of two teams that have beaten up on absolutely nobody so far this season. The Golden Gophers just hung 66 points on Northwestern State, which sounds impressive until you realize they scored 35 in the first quarter alone. I mean, when you're putting up your highest first quarter output since 1973 against an FCS team, you're basically playing a different sport. But here's what caught my eye. 9 different receivers caught passes. 10 running backs got carries. That's depth. And depth matters when you're flying across the country. Cal's sitting pretty at 2-0 after shutting out Texas Southern, but let's be honest, it's Texas Southern. The Bears allowed just 194 total yards, which looks great on paper, but context is everything in this business. What's actually interesting is their running game. Kendrick Raphael went from 37 yards in Week 1 to 131 yards on 7.3 per carry. That's not just improvement, that's a guy finding his rhythm. Now here's where it gets spicy for bettors. Minnesota's currently laying 1.5 points on the road, and the power ranking suggests they should be laying closer to 3. That's value, especially when you consider Cal's wins came against Oregon State, who's been a disaster, and an FCS team. But, and this is a big but, we're dealing with some legitimate injury concerns for the Gophers. Darius Taylor, their star running back, left early last week with what looked like another leg issue. Guy missed time in 2023, missed the opener this year with hamstring problems, and now this. Coach Fleck says it doesn't seem too bad, but coaches say a lot of things. The travel factor here is massive. 1,576 miles, 2-hour time adjustment, playing at what feels like 10:30 a.m. to their body clocks. That's not just a number on a map. That's a real disadvantage, even for a team with Minnesota's depth. Weather's perfect, 60 degrees, light winds from the southwest, no precipitation. So we can throw out any concerns about conditions affecting the game. This comes down to execution and who handles the moment better. Cal's got their true freshman quarterback Jaron Keawe Sagapalutule, who threw for 259 yards last week with just 1 pick. Kid's got some poise, but he hasn't seen anything like a Big Ten defense yet. Minnesota's allowing just 183 total yards per game through 2 contests, with multiple pick sixes and fumble recoveries. That defense travels. The narrative here is simple. Minnesota should win this game, and laying 1.5 feels light based on talent differential. But road favorites in these early season cross-country trips, they don't always show up the way you expect. Cal's got enough offensive pieces with Raphael running hard and a quarterback who's not afraid to sling it around. If Taylor's healthy and Minnesota plays to their capability, this should be a comfortable cover. But that's a lot of ifs for a team that just flew across the continent to play a game that feels like a scheduling afterthought.